You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of losing. A dimension of apathy. A dimension of disappointment. You're moving into a land of both cactus and sadness, of failed promises and broken dreams. You've just crossed over into the Coyotes zone. Hockey is truly a one-of-a-kind sport, one that demands unparalleled physicality, stamina, and skill. Its popularity has soared over time, going from a relatively niche sport in the early 20th century into one of the big four North American sports. The game has grown internationally over the decades. Perhaps most controversially, it has expanded to warm weather climates in the American South. These markets are often seen as undeserving of hockey compared to the more traditional northern climates where the sport is already ingrained in local culture. The perception has changed over time though, with the NHL granting Las Vegas an expansion team to begin in 2017. The Golden Knights made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in their first year of existence, and have remained a powerhouse ever since. In 2023, the Vegas Golden Knights hoisted the Stanley Cup in front of a raucous crowd to finally prove that hockey could not only survive, but thrive in the desert environment. In contrast to the immediate and rousing success of the Knights, 200 miles southeast sit the Arizona Coyotes, the NHL's first attempt to build hockey in the desert. They're the hockey equivalent of Charlie Brown trying to kick the football. Every time there's a glimmer of hope, Lucy lifts the football right from under them, and they fall over. Yet they continue to get up every time, no matter how futile it may seem, and keep trying to kick the ball, even when everyone is screaming at them not to. The Coyotes are truly unlike any team in professional sports. Many teams suffer financial losses, many teams suffer long stretches of losing, but the Coyotes are unique with how consistently they existed in this state of torment. For every tiny victory this team has gotten, they have suffered several crushing defeats to drown the fleeting feeling of happiness that most teams get to experience on a yearly basis. This sort of rot wasn't born in the Sonoran Desert, however. The story of this franchise's pain began in the bitter Manitoba cold. And before we get into it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. By the late 60s and early 70s, the NHL had recently expanded to assert itself as the premier hockey league in North America, but they were still holding on to unfair labor practices for their players. Players were at the mercy of their organizations and held very little bargaining power with their contracts, which were outrageously low to begin with. In 1971, a new league was founded to directly challenge the NHL, the World Hockey Association. The WHA was successfully able to lure several NHL players with the promise of better pay, with none more famous than Bobby Hull. Hull signed a previously unheard of 10-year, $2.5 million contract with one of the league's founding teams, the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets were one of the few bright spots in a league that was otherwise mired by financial trouble. Thanks to their roster full of genuine NHL talent, the Jets earned a trip to the finals in 5 of the league's 7 years of operation. They won the Avco World Trophy 3 times in that span, with the final of which coming against the Edmonton Oilers and their 18-year-old phenom, Wayne Gretzky. After the 1979 WHA Finals, the league finally ran out of steam and agreed to merge with the NHL. This merger would bring 4 of the remaining 6 teams to the NHL: the Edmonton Oilers, Hartford Whalers, Quebec Nordiques, and our Winnipeg Jets. The journey to the next level proved difficult thanks to the NHL's insistence on treating the WHA teams as expansion franchises. The 4 teams had to pay a $6 million expansion fee to the league right from the get-go, and were subject to a reclamation draft. This was essentially a culling of their rosters of NHL talent, with former players being forcibly returned to their old teams. After the reclamation draft, the newly founded teams had to rebuild their rosters through an extremely limited expansion draft. Apart from a few exceptions, such as the Jets getting to keep Bobby Hull and the Oilers keeping Wayne Gretzky, these organizations had to start from the ground up. Because they had just been a contender in the WHA, the Jets found themselves even more devastated by this expansion than their fellow teams. The Jets finished at the bottom of the standings in their first NHL season, during which they traded their former star Bobby Hull to the Hartford Whalers. Their league worst 51 points would be followed up the next season with a pitiful 32 points. The Jets only had 9 wins on the season, and with the worst offense and defense in the league, easily earned the #1 pick in the 1981 draft. Winnipeg used their #1 pick on Dale Hawerchuk. The 18-year-old elevated the Jets immediately, winning the Calder in an incredible 103-point season. The Jets made the playoffs for the first time since joining the NHL, but were promptly defeated by the St. Louis Blues. This began a cycle that lasted from 1982 to 1988, where the Jets would make the playoffs thanks to stellar seasons from Hawerchuk, but could not break through the second round. Specifically, they could not get past Wayne Gretzky and his Oilers, who used Winnipeg as a pit stop en route to a Stanley Cup victory 4 times in this span. In 1990, the Jets found themselves facing the Oilers once again in the first round of the playoffs. This time was different, however, as Gretzky had been traded away the season prior. Winnipeg had upstart talent on their side, with young goaltender Bob Essensa making the all-rookie team. The Jets jumped on their opportunity by grabbing a 3-1 lead into the series, winning Game 4 in double overtime. They kept their foot on the gas going into Game 5, holding a 3-1 lead halfway through the second period. Unfortunately, the Oilers answered back a few minutes later and rode that momentum to a game-tying goal 13 seconds later. The Oilers would go on to win the game and stave off elimination. Game 6 in Winnipeg featured a nightmarish opening for the home team, with the Oilers jumping out to a 3-0 lead in the first period. While the Jets eventually overcame the deficit in the third period, it was undone just moments later with a decisive Oilers goal. The series was now tied at 3 going back to Edmonton. The wheels had fallen off the bus for the Jets, and their 1990 team was buried in the decisive Game 7 in Edmonton. After a decade of failing to break into the top tier of NHL, this series was the straw that broke the camel's back and forced change in Winnipeg. Longtime face of the franchise Dale Hawerchuk was sent alongside the Jets' first-round pick to the Buffalo Sabres for their pick and several players, including standout defenseman Phil Housley. In the 1990 draft, the Sabres selected Brad May and the Jets selected Keith Tkachuk. Unfortunately, Tkachuk was not quite ready for the NHL yet, as the Jets regressed to a 63-point season in 90-91 without Hawerchuk. Their fortunes were quickly reversed in the 1991-92 season, where a resurgent Phil Housley combined with great seasons from Eddie Olczyk and Teppo Numminen to lead the Jets back to the playoffs. Despite veteran goaltender Bob Essensa having an outstanding season where he finished 4th in Vezina voting, he would not be starting their series against the Vancouver Canucks. The Game 1 starter would be 23-year-old Rick Tabaraki. The plan was working. The Jets stunned the Canucks crowd by taking Game 1 in Vancouver. Game 2 was a loss for the Jets, but Tabaraki saved 38 shots to keep an otherwise lopsided game close. The Jets came back to Winnipeg and outlasted the Canucks in both games, going up 3-1 in the series. A very physical first period in Game 5 remained scoreless for the first 17 minutes, but 2 quick Vancouver goals ultimately took the air out of Winnipeg's tires. The Canucks came out of the locker room with a foot on the gas, scoring 3 more goals to chase Tabaraki from the net. The Jets ultimately lost 8-2 and inexplicably announced that Tabaraki would be starting Game 6 in Winnipeg. As one would expect, Game 6 was an 8-3 drubbing by the Canucks, where there were no goaltender changes at all for the Jets. The 23-year-old rookie was being hung out to dry when the coach should have been handing it over to his Vezina finalist who was just sitting on the bench. John Paddock had a different vision, however. What if we just started Tabaraki again in Game 7? Well, as it turns out, that was not a winning strategy, as the Jets hit a brick wall and lost 5-0 in the decisive Game 7. Unlike their last playoff collapse, this was a young team that had arguably overperformed to get this series to 7 games. They would receive an infusion unlike any other in NHL history, however, with 1988 first-round pick Teemu Selanne finally making the move to the NHL from Finland. Selanne's rookie season was far and away the greatest rookie season in the sport's history, scoring a mind-boggling 132 points at age 22. With Phil Housley's playmaking at the blue line, this pair was practically guaranteed to score when given the opportunity. Selanne had easily shattered the rookie record for goals, which was held by Mike Bossy with 53. Selanne finished the 92-93 season with 76 goals, 23 more than the previous record. Even with weaker goaltending on the whole, the sheer firepower from these two players led the team to a better record than the season prior. They faced off against the Canucks once again, who improved in their own regards. Unfortunately, even with Bob Essensa starting the series, the Jets were easily defeated in 6 games. It was time for change once again for the team, as Phil Housley was traded to St. Louis for more scoring depth. Phil Housley was the key to the team's success in the post-Howard Chuck era, and his absence was felt immediately. None felt the impact more than Teemu Selanne, who ended the 1993-94 season with 54 points, 78 fewer than the season prior with Housley. For some inexplicable reason, on March 15, 1994, while the team's record was 19-44-8, the Jets traded their first-round pick to the Edmonton Oilers for financial considerations. This ended up being the 4th overall pick in the draft that year. The Jets rebounded slightly in the lockout-shortened 1994-95 season, but still finished with a poor enough record to earn the 7th pick in the 1995 draft. Thankfully, they kept this pick, and they used it on a winger from the WHL, Shane Doan. He took the ice in Winnipeg at age 19 and showed promise right from the get-go in a very physical, Tkachuk-led squad. Teemu Selanne had returned to his old self, scoring 72 points in 51 games just in time to be traded to the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim in February 1996. Even without Selanne, the Jets snuck into the final playoff spot in the West, where they got to face the 131-point Detroit Red Wings. The Jets gave them a good fight, but they were eliminated in Game 6 on April 28, 1996. Behind the scenes, it was no secret that the Jets were struggling financially. The Canadian dollar's value had been plummeting throughout the 90s, which had a catastrophic effect on the Jets' ability to pay their players. Trading Phil Housley was perhaps the most egregious example, but the financial woes of this team explain several of the otherwise baffling moves in the 90s. The Jets certainly weren't alone. Every Canadian market was feeling the increased pressure that they were not used to feeling. Commissioner Gary Bettman remains a very controversial figure, with perhaps his most mired quality being his sheer dedication to growing the game in non-traditional markets, no matter the cost. The early 90s saw the NHL making moves in every direction to reshape its structure, reorienting itself away from Canada and towards the American Sunbelt. The beginning of Bettman's tenure in 1993 was in the middle of a 5-team expansion effort set forth by John Ziegler. The league had welcomed 3 teams in the past 2 seasons: the San Jose Sharks, Ottawa Senators, and Tampa Bay Lightning. The Florida Panthers and Mighty Ducks of Anaheim would follow suit 8 months into Bettman's tenure. The landscape of the NHL was rapidly changing, and Bettman accelerated this change by encouraging struggling franchises to move south. In 1993, a Minnesota North Stars team that had made the Stanley Cup Finals just 2 seasons prior was suddenly relocated to Dallas, Texas. Despite the abrupt move of the North Stars being unpopular with fans, especially those in Minnesota who are arguably more dedicated than anybody to hockey, the NHL took notice of the potential of Southern hockey and decided that this was the future for their struggling teams. After the 1994-95 lockout, the Quebec Nordiques, who played in the smallest and most remote market in the league, were moved to Denver to become the Colorado Avalanche. Colorado had previously attempted to have an NHL franchise, which was a short-lived disaster known as the Colorado Rockies. This growing market had serious potential to be tapped, and what better way to kickstart it than with a Stanley Cup win in their first season? The Avs had not even existed for a year, and already cemented their legacy and legacy of hockey in the West. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1996, we find our Winnipeg Jets bleeding money in the smallest market in the league. The Jets' ownership saw the writing on the wall and scrambled to find a buyer. They found a prospective group that was looking to bring hockey back to Minnesota after the untimely moving of the North Stars. Unfortunately, that deal would not get off the ground, however, due to a lack of an appropriate arena in Minnesota of all places. The next option, and the one they ultimately went with, was to pack their bags and find refuge in the Sonoran Desert. Phoenix, Arizona, and all of its surrounding communities have been subject to exponential growth since the end of World War II. The population of the city had exploded from 65,000 in 1940 to nearly 440,000 just 20 years later. Even though the valley was isolated from other large population centers, the sheer population growth quickly led to an NBA expansion team in 1969, the Phoenix Suns. The Suns were the singular pride and joy of the city for nearly 2 decades, even as they failed to win a championship. But as the area's population kept increasing, Phoenix was often cited as a market for struggling sports teams to potentially move to. In 1988, the city got their second professional sports team, the Phoenix Cardinals. The Cardinals may have been terrible for their first decade in the desert, but they nonetheless proved that the Phoenix market could support multiple pro teams. This was further compounded in 1995 when MLB announced an expansion team in Phoenix, the Arizona Diamondbacks. They were set to begin play in 1998 in a brand new colossal stadium in downtown Phoenix. In just a few short years, the Valley went from just one professional sports team to potentially becoming a true four-sport city. While they never had a professional team beforehand, Phoenix was no stranger to hockey as a whole. In 1967, the Phoenix Roadrunners began play in the Veterans Memorial Coliseum for the Western Hockey League, one of several minor leagues that was looking to merge with the NHL in the future. The Roadrunners were consistently popular in town for a minor league team, and their rowdy crowds during repeat championships in 1973 and 74 were foundational to the stadium's nickname, the Madhouse on McDowell. Unfortunately, the WHL ceased operations following the Roadrunners' second championship in 1974, and the team was absorbed into the WHA, where they would face off against the Winnipeg Jets very often. The Roadrunners' short time in the WHA was very similar to how most franchises in the league were handled. Sandy Hockwell was a former beloved player that won the WHL's award for Best Defenseman twice, and later coached the team to the repeat championships. After just 2 seasons in the new WHA, and after winning Coach of the Year, the Roadrunners inexplicably fired Hockwell and replaced him with Al Rollins. Rollins was not well liked by the Roadrunner faithful, who remembered his time coaching the rival Salt Lake Golden Eagles. The financial instability of the WHA also made it so that the Roadrunners quite literally needed to sell players to pay the rent for the building, which resulted in a disastrous 1977 campaign where the team dropped by over 20 points in the standings. Along with several other WHA teams, the Roadrunners folded in the 1977 offseason. Over a decade would pass without hockey in the Valley, until 1989 when the IHL brought a new iteration of the Roadrunners to town. Unlike the last iteration, this team used a gray and blue color scheme. This version of the Roadrunners was ironically the most stable the team had been, playing in the Madhouse for 8 seasons throughout the 90s. However, by the time 1996 rolled around, it was finally time for professional hockey to make its debut in the desert. The Phoenix Coyotes, fresh with their bold Kachina-inspired logo, began play in 1996 in America West Arena. This arena was originally built as the new home for the Phoenix Suns just a few years prior, and was not intended to host hockey in the long term. The larger rink size compared to an NBA court led to many obstructed sightlines throughout the arena, which hampered the team's ability to draw a sellout crowd from the get-go. Even with its faults, it was absolutely an upgrade from the 40-year-old Winnipeg Arena. The relocation brought much of the same roster from Winnipeg, captained by a 24-year-old Keith Tkachuk. The roster had shown that they were good enough for the playoffs already, and they bolstered it before taking the ice. In August 1996, the Coyotes traded for the Blackhawks' Jeremy Roenick, one of the most popular players in the league for his outspoken nature and physical play style. Their backstop was Nikolai Khabibulin, who was still only 24 but showed promise as the team's goaltender of the future. The first game in Coyotes history was also their only game played in Hartford, Connecticut, where they lost 1-0 to the Whalers. Thankfully, the team rebounded and won their first game under the Coyotes' name 5-2 against the Boston Bruins just 2 days later. They won their home opener as well against the San Jose Sharks, with the crowd hearing Werewolves of London after every goal. As a whole, the team started slow, but they improved as the season went on, and they were rising in the standings. They ended their inaugural season with 83 points, which was good enough for the 5th seed in the West. The Coyotes had the chance to take the Valley by storm, but had to go through the Mighty Ducks and old friend Teemu Selanne. This was the first best-of-7 playoff series for both markets, and the Ducks rode that momentum to win the first 2 games on home ice. The Coyotes kept the whiteout tradition from their days in Winnipeg, and even if it didn't make much thematic sense, the local crowd absolutely loved it from day one. The Coyotes tied the series up at 2 games apiece, clamping down with their physical play. In the pivotal Game 5 in Anaheim, the Coyotes kept their foot on the gas and routed the Ducks 5-2. The Coyotes had a 3-2 advantage in the series and just needed to win Game 6 on their home ice to advance to the next round. Paul Kariya opened the scoring for Anaheim in the second, as the Ducks would add another goal in the second to go up 2-0 going into the third. The Coyotes got one back halfway through the third, and with little over 2 minutes left, Keith Tkachuk tied it up on the power play. Game 6 ended up going to overtime, with the Coyotes just needing 1 goal to advance to the semifinals. 7 minutes into overtime, Teemu Selanne dumps the puck into the offensive zone. Paul Kariya took this as an exceptionally long pass and absolutely rips it past Khabibulin. The Ducks pulled off the overtime win and they'd head back home for Game 7. Unfortunately, Anaheim used their momentum to shut out the Coyotes in the decisive Game 7. It was a heartbreaking fumbling of an opportunity to make a strong first impression in the Valley, but this was still a strong first season for a team in a new market after all. Before the season, Jim Schoenfeld was brought in to replace the inexperienced Don Hay. Schoenfeld had just finished a 4-season tenure with the Washington Capitals, where they made the playoffs in 3 of them. General manager Bobby Smith hoped to get the most out of his star players, and they started off the season relatively strong. They held a playoff spot for most of the beginning of the season, but started to taper off as time went on. After a cold streak in February surrounding the 2-week break for the 1998 Winter Olympics, it seemed like the Coyotes were going to miss the playoffs. Miraculously, however, the team buckled down and won 7 of their final 10 games, 5 of which were 1-goal victories. They finished with 82 points, and were up to face the defending champion Detroit Red Wings in the first round. After a predictable 6-3 loss to open the series, the Coyotes shocked Detroit by scoring 7 at Joe Louis Arena. The Red Wings opened Game 3 with 2 goals in the first minute, but Rick Tocchet and Jeremy Roenick stormed back in the third period to give the Coyotes the win. The wheels fell off the bus, however, as the Red Wings rattled off 3 consecutive wins to take the series 4-2. There's absolutely no shame in losing this series though, especially because it proved to be the toughest challenge the Red Wings would face en route to another Stanley Cup Finals victory. This was the team's 3rd season in the Valley, and the mostly static roster was still looking for their first playoff series victory. They were always close, but could never break through to the next level. After dropping the first game of the season, the Coyotes went on an unprecedented tear, winning 14 of their next 17 games and tying the remaining 2. Khabibulin not only rebounded from a poor season the year prior, but became one of the best goaltenders in the entire league. The Coyotes spent the beginning of the season atop the Western Conference. Their core was arguably in their prime, with Tkachuk, Roenick, Numminen, and Khabibulin all making the 1999 All-Star team. Once they returned to play, however, the Coyotes hit a major skid by losing 11 of 13 games in the middle of February, and fell into the familiar mediocre mix they've been accustomed to. They managed to right the ship late in the season, and finished strong enough to earn the 4th seed in the West, and were set to face the St. Louis Blues. After dropping Game 1 at home, the Coyotes rattled off 3 straight 1-goal victories, grabbing a 3-1 series lead with 2 road wins. In Game 5, Phoenix held a 1-0 lead until the middle of the 3rd period, and ultimately lost the game in overtime. The Yotes again held a 1-goal lead in the 2nd period of Game 6, only to let in 3 unanswered to bring the series back to Phoenix again. It was time for Game 7 once again, with a chance to finally get to the second round for the first time in Arizona. Both sides played a physical and grueling game, one that remained scoreless for all of regulation. The teams continued their battle for 17 minutes of overtime, at which point Ricard Persson fired on the net. The deflection from Pierre Turgeon gave the Blues a 1-0 win in the decisive Game 7. The blown 3-1 series lead was officially cemented in the record books. There was no denying it anymore. The Coyotes had officially carried over the Jets' playoff curse. The team parted ways with head coach Jim Schoenfeld after the season, but retained most of their key roster pieces. Even while much of the Coyotes core continued to stay the same, they were presented with new challenges. Star goaltender Nikolai Khabibulin was in a contract dispute with management and wouldn't play for the entire season as a result. The Coyotes had to rely on a tandem of mid-30s goalies to start the season, all-reliable Bob Essensa and Mikhail Stalinkov. The team seemed to rally in this adversity, however, as they won 8 of their first 11 games to start the season. Much of the team's success in the face of adversity can be credited to head coach Bobby Francis. Although he was a first-time NHL head coach, he was brought in to provide an offensive philosophy the team sorely needed. As the season went on, however, the results cooled off. The team managed to finish with 90 points, the same total as the year prior despite the coaching change. As the 6th seed, they got to face the Colorado Avalanche in the first round. The Coyotes were outplayed at every turn by the Joe Sakic-led powerhouse, being at the wrong end of a gentleman's sweep right out of the playoffs. The Avalanche were on an entirely different level from the Coyotes, and this series would just prove how far away these franchises really were from each other. The Coyotes continued to sit in neutral, as this was now the 4th season where they failed to advance in the playoffs. With the team's core starting to reach their 30s, this was seen as the last shot before the Coyotes would need to truly rebuild. Sean Burke got comfortable as the team's starter, and Khabibulin was sent to Tampa Bay where he finally would get his big contract. The team started off even stronger than the season prior, leading the Pacific Division to begin the season. The success would slowly fade away as the holidays approached, however, and the Coyotes were stuck in the familiar mix of lower-seeded playoff teams. Once it became clear that the team plateaued early in the season yet again, it was finally time for change. On March 13, 2001, Keith Tkachuk was sent to St. Louis for a first-round pick and a few solid young players in Ladislav Nagy and Michael Handzus. Mercifully, the Canucks held the tiebreaker over the Coyotes for the final playoff spot, so we were spared from another massacre at the hands of the Avalanche. Now that they missed the playoffs for the first time since moving to Phoenix, it was finally the end of an era. With Tkachuk gone, Jeremy Roenick moved on to Philadelphia, where he would continue producing at a high level. The old guard was thinning out, but with Teppo Numminen being named captain, the future was still bright for the Coyotes. The team saw the sudden roster shift not as a rebuild, but rather a retool into a different core. The front office made a bold move, trading a second-round pick and a 2003 first-round pick for 25-year-old Damon Langko. He would end up with the team's highest point total of the season, helping boost the Coyotes' offense back into the upper half of the league. The season also saw the emergence of Daniel Briere, who had been with the team since 1997. He finished 2002 with 60 points, which is 20 more than he had in his first 4 seasons combined. The returns in the Tkachuk trade were panning out, with Handzus and Nagy both having 40 points to finally aid depth scoring. By the All-Star break, the Coyotes were tied for the 8th seed in the Western Conference, already improving over the season prior. Unlike seasons past, the team actually played some of their best hockey to end the season. They won 6 in a row in March, and continued to gain ground in the playoff race. Rookie Chris Kolanos had a strong rookie season, and on March 30th, 2002, he scored a penalty shot on Patrick Waugh. Waugh's explosive reaction became the focus of the team's 2002 whiteout commercial.
Hockey stick, $48. Skates, $275. Official NHL puck, $10. Making a future Hall of Fame goalie cry like a little baby.
Kolanos, he scored! Now Patrick throws his stick. Oh, he's upset.
Priceless.
The team had regained some of its former swagger, as they finished the season with a then-team record of 95 points on the season. In a hyper-competitive Western Conference, this was good enough for the 6th seed in a matchup with the heavyweight San Jose Sharks. In Game 1, a second-period goal by Patrick Marleau, assisted by our old friend Teemu Selanne, would ultimately be the game winner for the Sharks. Game 2 was an entirely different story, with Langkow, Doan, and Briere powering the team to a 3-1 win on the road. Once the Coyotes returned home, however, their offense went quiet as the Sharks outscored them 10-3 in the final 3 games of the series. The only offense generated was by Shane Doan and by penalty shots. Only the Coyotes could have such a disappointing finish in a season where they objectively exceeded expectations. The Coyotes roster remained mostly the same for the 2002-03 season, but the flaws in the roster that were exposed by San Jose continued to weigh the team down. The team's all-star goaltender Sean Burke began the season with health issues and was sidelined by mid-October. The team had its struggles, but ultimately treaded water in the standings until Sean Burke's return in December. Upon his return, Burke was playing some of the best hockey of his career, posting a .936 save percentage and a 10-3-1 record between December and March. This resurgence actually gave the Coyotes an outside shot at a playoff spot, but on March 20th, Sean Burke exited a game against Edmonton with an injury. He would be sidelined for the next week, which was all the team needed to absolutely implode. They won just one of their final 8 games and finished the season with 78 points. This was the worst finish in the team's time in Phoenix, and they didn't even have a draft pick to show for it. Their first round pick belonged to the Flyers thanks to the Lanko trade, and they used the pick to select Jeff Carter 11th overall. The 2003 draft is often considered one of the best of all time, mostly due to the sheer depth of quality players. The Coyotes didn't have a pick in this draft until the 3rd round. In the first round, they missed out on the likes of Zach Parise, Brett Burns, and Brent Seabrook. The second round could have given them Patrice Bergeron, Shea Weber, or David Backes, among others. But instead, they continued barreling into a future that they did not prepare for. Behind the scenes, trouble had been brewing for the team. America West Arena was known to be a terrible venue for hockey, with many seats having an obstructed view of the ice. Jerry Colangelo, the Suns owner at the time, was instrumental in getting the Coyotes to Phoenix and setting them up for potential future success, but the team clearly needed their own building. Phoenix businessman Richard Burke was the Coyotes' original owner, and he was adamant about making sure the team stayed put. Burke unfortunately could not weather the financial losses downtown and was looking for potential buyers that would keep the team in the valley. One of those buyers was Phoenix-based Elman Companies and their owner, Steve Elman. In 1995, 6 years prior to owning the Coyotes, Steve Elman purchased the Los Arcos Mall in Scottsdale, Arizona. In an all-too-common cycle in Phoenix, the Vintage Mall was going through hard times as a result of new competition springing up nearby. Elman Companies immediately began workshopping new ideas for the property, and with the Coyotes publicly needing a new arena in the late 90s, this site seemed like the perfect match. In 1997, Elman unveiled 3 potential redevelopments of the property, one of which being a new stadium for the Coyotes. A year later in 1998, Elman created a concrete proposal for the new development. The $600 million development would include the new stadium and a power center for big box stores. Because Steve Elman wasn't actually wealthy enough to build an NHL arena on his own, the site would be funded by public tax dollars. This surprisingly ended up not being a problem in May 1999, where record public turnout in favor of the arena helped move the process towards another vote in November. Elman did himself no favors by announcing a proposal to recapture all tax funds generated by the property over a 30-year period, which effectively would have put a huge subsidy on Scottsdale residents. Regardless, the people of Scottsdale wanted hockey in town, and they came out to vote for the measure. Things were actually looking good for the future of the team, but cracks began to show when owner Richard Burke could not agree with Steve Elman on financing and the construction timeline, which would render the Coyotes stuck at America West Arena for another 4 seasons. In what may have been seen as the logical move at the time, the team was sold in full to Steve Elman for $87 million in April 2000. With the same person owning both the team and the property to build the stadium on, as well as public support being on their side, it really seemed like this could actually work. Unfortunately, even with all of the help provided by the city and local residents, the reality is that Steve Elman did not have the money to be a proper NHL owner, much less financing a brand new stadium in the most expensive part of the Phoenix area. Even with freshly retired legend Wayne Gretzky signing on as a minority owner, it took over a year for the sale of this team to be finalized. Once Elman was actually given the keys to the franchise and told to put up or shut up, his grandiose plans would continuously be scaled back. It took just 5 months for him to begin to scout other potential sites in other cities, despite the wishes of Scottsdale voters. By 2001, Elman had officially given up on his own plan to develop a stadium in the Los Arcos Mall and set his eyes on a completely new plan. On April 11th, 2001, the rug was pulled out from under everyone's feet, and the team's plans would move westward. Instead of building a new arena in the core of the Phoenix area where the fan base was actually located and fulfilling his promises to the Scottsdale taxpayers, Ellman had a master plan for an entirely new entertainment district on the west side of town. His company bought up a bunch of cheap farmland in suburban Glendale, and work began on the new Westgate City Center. Even though the ownership had obviously cheapened out with the land itself, the Westgate development on its own was an ambitious undertaking. The project would be built out in multiple phases, starting with the arena to open in 2003 and eventually working out into retail and residential accommodations by the end of 2006. The major flaw with this plan wasn't with the arena itself, but with just how far away it was from the core fans in the valley. It was 15 miles west of America West Arena, which further alienated those living in Scottsdale or the greater Mesa area. With games often starting at 7 p.m. local time, the only way to get to the arena for most people was to trek across the I-10 during rush hour. Any person that's been to Phoenix can tell you how much that drive sucks and should be avoided unless it's absolutely necessary. But that was the reality for hockey in Arizona now. On top of the new arena, it was time for a uniform update. Gone were the NHL's most unique look in the black Kachina jerseys, replaced with the maroon Howling Coyote head and Sedona red jerseys. These jerseys were well received, but many preferred the originality of the Kachina jerseys. During the 2003 offseason, Captain Teppo Numminen was traded to the Dallas Stars. The captaincy would finally be handed down to Shane Doan. It was officially time for a new era of hockey in Arizona, the Howling Head era. Coming off a 78-point season in 02-03, there was not much optimism for the future of the team. While Shane Doan was further rounding his game, the rest of the roster lacked the depth and star power to be anything but a bottom feeder. The team started off poorly, but managed to stay around 500 by mid-December. While the team was supposed to start the season in their new arena, construction delays continued to push the date further and further back. The Coyotes started the season at America West Arena even after rebranding to their new uniforms, but thankfully it was short-lived. The first game in Glendale Arena history was on December 27, 2003, a Coyotes loss against the Nashville Predators. For all the surrounding circumstances and surrounding farmland around the stadium, the fans still showed up, and the arena itself was state-of-the-art. The team even had a new goal horn, which sounded great even if the change from Werewolves of London to crowd chant was a bit bland. The Coyotes had a small winning streak after the move, propelled by an incredible shutout streak by Brian Boucher. He recorded 5 consecutive shutouts to begin the 2004 calendar year, ending with a monumental 332 consecutive minutes without a goal allowed, which shattered the previous NHL record by over 30 minutes. The good times would not last long, however, as the team began to crater in the standings once this feel-good story was over. After a 1-1 tie against the lowly Mighty Ducks in February, the Coyotes decided to part ways with coach Bobby Francis. This unfortunately was the only NHL gig that Coach Francis would get, and interim coach Rick Bowness would lead the team the rest of the way, only winning 2 of their last 20 games. For their tanking efforts at the end of the season, the Coyotes were awarded the 5th pick in the 2004 draft despite having fewer wins than the top 2 selectors, Washington and Pittsburgh. Missing out on Alexander Ovechkin and Evgeny Malkin, the Coyotes went to select Blake Wheeler 5th overall. While Blake Wheeler would have a great NHL career, it would not come in a Coyotes uniform, as he opted to return to college and wouldn't begin pro play until 2008 with the Boston Bruins. On September 16, 2004, just one day before the expiration of the collective bargaining agreement, a lockout was initiated. Both sides could not agree on terms throughout 2004, and the entire 2004-05 season was cancelled as a result. The lockout could not have come at a worse time for the Coyotes, as they had only just moved into Glendale 5 months prior. The arrival in Glendale was already unceremonious, with the stadium just being left alone in a sea of farmland. Attendance was strong at the new arena in 2004, which makes the timing of this lockout even more devastating. We lost an entire season of hockey in 04-05, and this would have been the Coyotes' first full season in Glendale. The organization had been banking on this exact season to recoup the losses that had been mounting since the team moved to Phoenix, but instead they just had to sit idly by as the hype for the new arena died alongside the doomed 2004-05 season. The 2005 draft lottery had to use a different formula considering there was no season to base the odds on. Teams that missed the playoffs from 2001 to 2004 would receive 3 lottery balls. 2 lottery balls went to teams that appeared one time in that span, and only 1 ball for teams that appeared multiple times. The Coyotes fit into the second category, in the same group as teams like the Ducks, Hurricanes, and Wild, who appeared in the playoffs one time in that 3-year period. The Coyotes were expected to pick somewhere between 7 and 10, but found themselves falling all the way down to 17. For reference, those teams I just mentioned, they ended up with picks 2 through 4. Pick 5 went to Montreal, who only had 1 ball, and they used the pick on the future of their franchise, Carey Price. The Coyotes ultimately were able to make the most out of their pick by selecting Martin Hanzal, a large frame center whose grit complemented that of Shane Doan. As the lockout ended in 2005, Wayne Gretzky made the move to become the team's next head coach while still retaining his share of ownership. This was Gretzky's first attempt at coaching, but it was widely assumed he would be naturally good at it. He was the great one after all. The Coyotes had absolutely no prospects to develop, so they decided to go the complete opposite direction. With so much of the league shifting to a youth focus, the Coyotes attempted to half-heartedly compete with a bunch of old guys. To replace Sean Burke, the team signed 38-year-old Curtis Joseph to fill the gap. They even signed a 41-year-old Brett Hull. That surely will bring in the results. The team actually got out to a strong start, sitting 1 point from a playoff spot after a win in Boston on December 11th. It was at this point, however, that the team began to pile on the losses. Perhaps the lowlight for the team during the Gretzky era came on January 16, 2006, when Alexander Ovechkin scored an incredible goal on Brian Boucher in a blowout loss. This came during the team's worst stretch of the season, where they were routed regularly. The Coyotes finished the season with 81 points, just barely under 500. Even though this was an improvement over last season on paper, this was largely a result of inflated point totals across the league, as the Coyotes finished 14 points away from a playoff spot. The team lacked any sort of youth going forward as well, so a 500 finish in what was seen as a last gasp for relevancy for the team was a major disappointment. The 2006-07 season was more of the same, with Shane Doan leading the team in scoring, followed by journeymen and young players that couldn't cut it anywhere else. The team's identity issues continued to get worse, as they doubled down on their aging reputation by bringing back Jeremy Roenick for the season. After all, why develop new talent when there's Howling Head Jeremy Roenick jerseys to sell? With a now 39-year-old Curtis Joseph still being the team's top goaltender, the team got out to a predictably terrible start. They weren't just losing, in their first month of play they had more 4+ goal losses than total victories. At this point, the Coyotes had committed to being a sideshow. A random streak of competency in December saved the team from an embarrassing record, but the 06-07 Coyotes had just 67 points over the season, which was their lowest total since moving to Phoenix. At least the next season wasn't cancelled this time, and the Coyotes were able to select Kyle Turris 3rd overall in 2007. Curtis Joseph finally had enough of this whole situation in Glendale and went up to Calgary for one last shot at a cup before retirement. Even with some youth finally seeing ice time in the form of Keith Yandel and Martin Hanzal, Coach Gretzky could never get anything more than mediocrity out of his squad. General Manager Mike Barnett was let go after this rock-bottom season, and would be replaced by Don Maloney. The team's uniforms underwent a slight yet very noticeable change this season, with the piping along the bottom of the jersey being removed and replaced with a red collar. Unfortunately, on the ice, it was time for yet another slow start under Wayne Gretzky. The low point of the season came in early November, where they played the Sharks 3 times in a row and lost by a combined score of 15-1. To a certain extent, it seemed like this embarrassment woke the team up a bit, as they actually rebounded to play some of their best hockey under Gretzky for the next few months. That's not saying much though, but the Coyotes hung around 500 and were fighting for an outside shot at a playoff spot in January. Shane Doan expanded his playmaking ability and had a career-high 50 assists, most of which were to free agent acquisition Radim Verbata. The biggest surprise of the season was definitely Peter Mueller. The 19-year-old center that was drafted just the season prior ended up playing 81 games on the season and ended up third on the team in points. The only two players that played more games, defensemen Keith Ballard and Derek Morris, helped anchor team defense in a way that hadn't been seen in years. Ilya Bryzgalov, the team's new goalie acquired from Anaheim, also shined with a .921 save percentage. Regardless, the team's lack of depth scoring kept them 8 points from a playoff spot and extended the drought to 5 seasons. But for once, the team looked like they were actually beginning to have a future. This season saw the first alternate jersey for the team since their move to Glendale. This black jersey featured a running coyote and prominently featured the sand coloring of the Howling Head logo in the piping. Radim Verbata left the team in free agency, and his absence was felt, even after trading for Olli Jokinen. While they started off the season above 500, the losses quickly started piling up before the end of December. Their record never got too terrible, but it was clear that they did not have a very high ceiling. Besides Doan and Jokinen, this team just could not get anything done offensively. Some of the team's youth continued to make strides, such as Kyle Turris and Mikkel Bodker, but the team was obviously not moving in the right direction under Gretzky. The nail in the coffin was a noticeable step back from Bryzgalov and team defense, which caused the team to fall back down to 79 points and extend the playoff drought to 6 seasons. At this point, it was clear that this team was fundamentally flawed, and it wasn't just the ineffective coaching of Wayne Gretzky. The ownership was entirely disinterested in hockey as a sport, and the roster suffered greatly for it. Even the team's advertising was noticeably low budget. Their ad campaign from around this time centered around Pierre the Fanatic Hockey Snowman. The ads are plenty of fun, but it's clear they were trying to make the best out of a bad situation. Even the most resilient of markets would be struggling to draw in fans under these circumstances, but the situation in Glendale was truly a disaster without comparison. Steve Ellman's decision to not build an arena on the site that he already owned in Scottsdale, and instead buying cheap farmland in Glendale for Westgate, was cataclysmic for the team. The poor location was one thing, but the actual development of the land might have been even more troubled. While the arena itself opened in 2003, construction on the rest of Westgate didn't even begin until 2005. From there, it would still be an entire year until the first shops around the arena opened. This meant from 2003 to 2006, this new entertainment district was hinging entirely on the Coyotes for revenue, and as you remember, there was an entire season canceled in the middle of that. The sheer number of factors going against this move to Glendale, combined with a terrible on-ice product and an impending recession, created a perfect storm for this team to bleed money like no team had before. Around this time in 2006, Steve Ellman sold his interest in the team to minority owner Jerry Moyes. Moyes actively had no interest in hockey and immediately tried to pass off the team to anybody else that would buy them. He was willing to sell to anybody, regardless of their plans for the team, and showed absolutely no respect towards the NHL and its rules. This dynamic continued through 2007 and into early 2008, at which point Jerry Moyes announced that he would no longer be providing funds to the team. Because a hockey team obviously needs money to operate, the NHL had no choice but to take control of hockey operations from Moyes in 2008. While Moyes retained ownership for the time being, both parties were desperate to find a group to buy the team. By May 2009, the league was prepared to make a formal bid with a group led by Jerry Reinsdorf. Despite Reinsdorf being the owner of the Chicago Bulls and White Sox, he stated his intentions on keeping the Coyotes in Arizona. However, this deal was not favorable to Moyes, who already viewed the team as an annoyance and financial drain on top of several other companies he was in charge of. Mere hours before Bettman could officially make the offer with Reinsdorf, Jerry Moyes decided to declare bankruptcy for the entire organization. Along with this awesome bankruptcy move, Moyes announced his intent to sell the team to Jim Balsillie. At this point, Balsillie was infamous around the league for attempting to buy teams and move them to his hometown of Hamilton, Ontario. He failed to buy the Penguins, the Predators, and now he was hoping the third time would be the charm with the Coyotes. On July 29th, the NHL Board of Governors rejected this ownership bid from Balsillie by a vote of 29-1. The one vote, of course, being a representative from Jerry Moyes. Even with this resounding defeat by the NHL Board of Governors, Moyes kept the circus going for several months by claiming the NHL was violating antitrust laws by not letting him sell to his preferred partner. These claims were baseless and went nowhere. When it was all said and done, the Coyotes were sold to the NHL for $140 million. Beyond the economics, the team took a massive hit to its reputation during this time. While many fans across the league remembered the days of Roenick and Tkachuk, the financial reality of the franchise became common knowledge. The narrative quickly became one in which the reason the Coyotes were failing financially was because the team had no fans and that hockey didn't belong in the desert. This certainly wasn't helped by the NHL being in control of the team, which is still often seen as them propping up a failed project. It's worth remembering though that while the Coyotes' attendance has never been that strong, it's never been some sort of negative outlier. In 2007, a year where they lost a projected $45 million, they had a higher average attendance than 6 other teams, including the Blackhawks and the Bruins. There are plenty of hockey fans in Arizona, but not everybody is willing to drive to the middle of nowhere to watch a clown show of a team, especially on weeknights. Needless to say, the reason for this team's financial failure can be put squarely on the shoulders of Steve Yzerman and Jerry Moyes. Yzerman should have never been a serious bidder for an NHL franchise in the first place, and his blindsiding of Scottsdale residents in 2001 set the organization down this disastrous path. The ship could have been righted, but he just had to sell to the guy that couldn't get the other half of Westgate built in 3 years. And while Yzerman would get the rest of Westgate done by 2009, Jerry Moyes was busy running the Coyotes into the ground. His outright hostility towards the NHL and refusal to operate the team as a proper owner plunged the team into a spiral that they never truly recovered from. As the story continues, it's important to remember the sheer numbers involved in this bankruptcy. In Jerry Moyes' 3 seasons as owner, the team lost $73 million, and $45 million in 2008-09 alone. The team continued to lose money after cutting Moyes loose, but that figure would never come close to those catastrophic figures. With the NHL's takeover of the team, Wayne Gretzky finally stepped down as head coach. Gretzky had been a part owner alongside Steve Yzerman, and was now no longer affiliated with the team in any way. Dave Tippett would take over the team, and despite the noise behind the scenes, the Coyotes began finding success in a new identity. Tippett's gritty style of coaching was exactly what a roster lacking star power needed all along. Even though Shane Doan's production slowed down, he was still the team's top scorer with 55 points. His supporting cast finally started to come into their own, with great seasons from Radim Verbata and Matthew Lombardi. The Coyotes had become a legitimate threat in the Western Conference for the first time since moving to Glendale, and was finally back on the hockey map after years of disappointment. The biggest story of the season was Ilya Bryzgalov, who rebounded to finish second in Vezina voting with a 2.29 goals against average. The team finished with 107 points, which easily became the franchise record. After 7 seasons of floating around aimlessly, the Coyotes had finally broken the playoff drought. The reward for such a strong season was a date with the Detroit Red Wings in the first round. The Red Wings were fresh off back-to-back finals appearances, sporting Datsuk and Zetterberg in their primes. The Coyotes had home ice advantage in the series, and the whiteout was in full force for the first time in Glendale. The Coyotes rode the raucous crowd to a tight Game 1 victory, but a Zetterberg hat trick in Game 2 would send the series back to Detroit tied 1 game apiece. The Coyotes surprisingly went into Joe Louis Arena and won Game 3 before being shut out 2 nights later. In the all-important Game 5 in Glendale, the Coyotes just could not get past Jimmy Howard in a 4-1 loss. With their backs against the wall, Dave Tippett and company went back to Joe Louis Arena and stunned the Detroit crowd by winning 5-2 in Game 6. This was a familiar situation for the Coyotes, only needing 1 more home win to advance to the second round for the first time since moving to Phoenix. In a throwback to their days at America West Arena, the Coyotes played a strong yet scoreless first period. And continuing with that throwback, the team absolutely imploded in the second period. Pavel Datsuk scored twice in a 2-minute span to begin the period, and although the Coyotes got one back, Detroit was clearly in the driver's seat at this point. Nicklas Lidstrom would score on the power play soon after, and Detroit would cruise to a 6-1 dominant win in the decisive Game 7. It was a hard-fought 7-game series, but it ultimately just wasn't meant to be. Brzgalov could only keep the potent Detroit offense at bay for so long, and the levee broke halfway through Game 7. It was disappointing that they couldn't seal the deal on home ice and win their first playoff series in Arizona, but there's no shame in going the distance against the late 2000s Red Wings. After being shoved into the basement in their first half-decade in Glendale, the Coyotes finally had an identity under Dave Tippett. They played hard-nosed old-school hockey, and their stout defense gave their goaltenders an edge regardless of who it was. GM Don Maloney was recognized for his achievements in rebuilding the roster and was the recipient of the first General Manager of the Year award in 2010. The 2010-11 season did see a slight regression for the team, but the roster was still intact and playing their brand of hockey. Team scoring stayed consistent, even with top center Matthew Lombardi moving on to Nashville before the season. To replace Lombardi, journeyman Ray Whitney joined the team, and showed no signs of slowing down even at age 38. The team started off their season in Prague, where they split a 2-game series against the Boston Bruins. As they returned to America, the Coyotes showed some jet lag with a below 500 start to the season. Thankfully though, they gained momentum as the season carried on, and they found themselves on the winning end of several one-goal games down the stretch. At some random point in the middle of the season, the team adopted a new goal song. Howlin' For You by the Black Keys was brand new at the time, and while several teams adopted the song into their rotation of stadium jams, the song was the perfect fit for the Coyotes' goal song. Brzgalov had another excellent season in net, but didn't receive the same attention for it. Keith Yandle was already one of the better defensemen in the league, and his 48 assists this season propelled him to the top of the conversation. He finished 5th in Norris voting, above the likes of Chris Letang and Duncan Keith. The team would finish with 99 points, good enough for the 6th seed and a date with the Detroit Red Wings. This matchup would not resemble the hard-fought series from a year prior. Detroit had a 3-goal period 3 separate times en route to a sweep. The Coyotes were never blown out in this short series, but it was clear that this current core needed a shakeup to get past their own demons. During the offseason, the Coyotes shipped Brzgalov to Philadelphia for a 3rd-round pick. While he could get the job done in the regular season, his shaky playoff performances left the team yearning for more. Less than a month later, former Tampa Bay backup Mike Smith joined the team. Smith was named Rookie of the Year for goaltending back in 2007 for the Stars, but struggled to keep consistent starting time afterwards. Aside from the addition of Smith, it was mostly the same squad rolling into the next season. During the 2011 offseason, the Atlanta Thrashers were suddenly relocated to Winnipeg, officially bringing back the Winnipeg Jets brand. The history of the original Jets would remain with the Coyotes, however. The Thrashers' play-by-play announcer, Matt McConnell, would join the Coyotes' broadcast booth, joining former Coyote Tyson Nash. The Coyotes started the season off relatively mediocre, but were still fighting for a playoff spot in a very competitive Western Conference. It was clear from the get-go that the team had fixed up issues defensively, to the point where their blue line was generating a lot of their offense. Keith Yandle and 20-year-old Oliver Ekman-Larsson always managed to get the puck on the net and create chaos in the crease. While Ekman-Larsson debuted in the previous season, this was undoubtedly his breakout year. On January 7th against the Islanders, Shane Doan got on the board twice in the first half of the game. Despite being in his 15th season, Shane had yet to record a hat trick in his career. With just under 5 seconds to go, Whitney drops a pass to Doan, who just barely beats the buzzer to finally record his first career hat trick. The team had slowly slid from a playoff spot in mid-January, but they returned from the All-Star break with new determination. They won 11 of their 12 games in February, with the lone loss coming in a shootout against the eventual President's Trophy winners in Vancouver. During this winning streak, the Coyotes traded for Antoine Vermette to make up some sorely needed center depth. Mike Smith came into town with his now iconic Wile E. Coyote mask and had the season of his life. A .930 save percentage, 2.21 goals against average, and a spot as a Vezina finalist. Smith's excellent numbers and fiery personality made him an instant fan favorite in Phoenix and a new face of the franchise. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for through the years in Dallas and Tampa, and he was not letting it go to waste. Ray Whitney was the star of the show on offense, putting up 77 points at age 39. Nobody could have seen this coming. Whitney looked like he was on his way to retirement after a poor previous season. The Coyotes finished the year with 97 points, which was fewer than last year, but good enough for first in the Pacific Division. This put them in an interesting 3-6 matchup with the Chicago Blackhawks, who had more points than the Coyotes yet did not win their division. Game 1 was a shooting frenzy for both sides, with Jonathan Toews getting on the board first for Chicago. Payet and Vermette would strike back in the second to give Phoenix the lead that they would take deep into the third. With only 15 seconds left in the game, Brent Seabrook beats Mike Smith and sends the game to overtime. The Blackhawks would come out swinging in overtime, but Smith continued to be a brick wall and denied any chances. The Coyotes had a face-off in the offensive zone halfway through the period, and a deflection from Martin Hanzal gave the Coyotes a 1-0 lead in the series. Game 2 was eerily similar, with Chicago taking an early lead and Phoenix clawing back to take the lead going into the third. Once again, the third period was scoreless until a Chicago shot found its way in with under a minute to play, once again involving Brent Seabrook. The Blackhawk offense was just too strong to hold in overtime, however, as Brian Bickle evened up the series going back to Chicago. Game 3 started off on a very sour note. Midway through the first period, fourth liner Rafi Torres laid out a reckless and devastating hit to Chicago star Marian Hossa. Hossa would need to be lifted off the ice in a stretcher, and somehow Torres avoided any penalty for the hit in the game itself. After some heated exchanges, both teams would cool down a bit after the hit, and the trend of the series would continue. Chicago scored first for the third game in a row deep into the first period. The 1-0 score would hold until a quick barrage in the third period for both teams, first with Rusty Klesla tying the game up. Just over 30 seconds later, Michael Frolik returned the lead back to Chicago. And another 30 seconds after that, Ray Whitney finds the back of the net to tie the game back up. For the third game in a row, we would need overtime. Chicago would dominate most of the puck possession in overtime, but a weird angle shot from Mikhail Bodkar was all that Phoenix needed to go up in the series. Torres would be suspended for the rest of the playoffs for his idiotic hit, which cost the Coyotes some much-needed physicality. Game 4 would flip the script, as neither team could score in the first or second periods. Chicago dominated possession, but they just could not get past Mike Smith. The third period saw two Coyotes goals within a minute of each other from Doan and Payet. Something about these two goals woke Chicago up, however, as they would tie the game back up and send us to a fourth straight overtime. Once again, Chicago mostly dominated the possession, but a breakaway by Bodkar resulted in maybe the softest goal that Corey Crawford has ever given up, and gave Phoenix a commanding 3-1 series lead. After suffering two close losses at home at the hands of Mikhail Bodkar, Chicago would come into Jobbing.com Arena ready to leave it all on the ice. Phoenix would strike first in the second period, but in the third, Nick Leddy was finally able to beat Smith to tie the game. It was now time for the fifth straight overtime game of the series. This one would only last for about 3 minutes, however, as Jonathan Toews was able to bury it to keep Chicago's hopes alive. Game 6 in United Center was Mike Smith's magnum opus, meeting all of Chicago's pressure and recording a 39-save shutout to ice the series on the road. A bit of an anticlimactic ending for Chicago fans. Chicago had nearly 100 more shots in this series than Phoenix did, but the brick wall of Mike Smith put up a .950 save percentage and put the team on his back. More importantly, this victory finally meant that the playoff curse was over. The team had finally won a playoff series for the first time in 8 tries since moving to Arizona 15 years prior. The monkey was finally off their back and they could look forward to the next round. Thankfully, round 2 would not be against the Detroit Red Wings, but rather the Nashville Predators. On paper, they seemed like the better version of this Coyotes team. Pekka Rinne finished right above Mike Smith in Vezina voting, and their offense was more potent with the likes of Martin Erat and David Legwand. Game 1 was a very direct continuation of the Blackhawks series, with the teams going back and forth and eventually reaching the end of regulation tied 3 apiece. It was time for overtime once again. 14 minutes into the extra period, Martin Hanzal won the face-off and Ray Whitney buried it to give the Coyotes the Game 1 victory. Game 2 finally saw the Coyotes offense wake up as they outshot the Preds en route to a convincing 5-3 win. Pekka Rinne and the entire Nashville defense strengthened up and reminded everybody why they were originally favored in this series in Game 3. Rinne recorded a 32-save shutout, and the Preds took a game on their home ice even with the Coyotes dominating possession. Game 4 was similarly tight, with Shane Doan giving the Coyotes an early lead in the first period. There wasn't much offense to speak of after this, and Mike Smith would hold on to that lead with a 25-save shutout. Up 3-1, the Coyotes returned home on the verge of their first conference finals appearance. This felt truly surreal. They had Nashville completely on the ropes, and this was the first time that most Coyotes fans felt confident in the team closing things out. Nashville would not go quietly into the night and attacked Smith relentlessly. The Great Wall stayed intact, and we remained scoreless until Shane Doan kicked out a pass to Derek Morris, who blew it right past Rinne. Martin Hansel would score from the same spot 10 minutes later, and that's all she wrote. The Preds would score in the third period and certainly gave Smith some true tests, but the Coyotes would emerge victorious. They were off to the conference finals for the first time in franchise history. The Coyotes looked good enough to play for the Stanley Cup, which was a strange sentence to write, and it's honestly even weirder saying it out loud now. The offense was just potent and hard-hitting enough to complement Mike Smith's incredible goaltending. Even though they defeated the Predators in 5 games, their opponent for the conference final was already determined. The Los Angeles Kings were an 8 seed, and they were in the midst of the most impressive and unexpected playoff run in the modern era. Goaltender Jonathan Quick finished second in Vezina voting, and likewise stole the show in the opening round as the Kings stunned the 1-seed Vancouver Canucks in 5 games. The Kings' offense got a jolt in the second round as they demolished the hopes and dreams of the St. Louis Blues in a sweep. These two teams were on a collision course for each other. They played a very similar brand of hockey, they were division rivals, and neither had a Stanley Cup to speak of. It was the most bizarre matchup in the conference finals, and a very fitting meeting for such a chaotic postseason. The Kings may not have been as miserable as the Coyotes, but they themselves had not advanced in the playoffs since 2001. Game 1 started off similarly to the rest of the Coyotes' playoff run, with the teams going back and forth scoring through the first 2 periods. Once the third period came, however, the Kings would put their foot on the gas and drive away with a 4-2 win. The Coyotes continued to sputter in Game 2, getting shut out 4-0 at home off the back of a Jeff Carter hat trick. Quick barely had to do anything, netting a 24-save shutout. Frustration and bad blood between the teams was apparent, with this game beginning a trend of dirty hits from both teams and an often full penalty box. Tippett clearly was embarrassed with the team's performance in Game 2, and as the series shifted back to LA, we saw a return to the team's normal brand of hockey. Damon Langko gave the Coyotes their first lead of the series, but it was short-lived as the Kings responded just over 2 minutes later. Dwight King of the Kings scored quickly in the third, and the Coyotes could not muster enough chances to pull out of the hole. They were down 3-0 in the series, and for the first time in this postseason, the Coyotes were on the ropes and just waiting for the knockout blow. This message didn't quite get through to Shane Doan and Mike Smith, who possibly had their best performances in Game 4. Doan scored the only 2 goals in the game and led all forwards in ice time by a large margin. Smith would grab a 36-save shutout, and the brooms could be safely put away. Game 5 was an appropriate change in tone from the low-shot games in LA, and both goaltenders were under constant siege. Goals on both sides were flying in the first 2 periods, but we ultimately would arrive in the third all tied up. Dustin Brown did his characteristic, technically legal but still an asshole knee move to Michael Roosevelt. No penalties were declared, and the Kings would go on to win the series mere seconds after the ensuing face-off. And that's it. That was the pinnacle of the Coyotes hockey experience, getting embarrassed by Los Angeles on home ice in the conference finals. A bittersweet end to a miracle of a season that nobody who witnessed it will ever forget. At the time, it felt like this could be the start of something special, finally turning the page for the franchise. The team needed to prove that the conference finals run was a sign of things to come and that it wasn't just a mirage. However, after the Kings defeated the Devils to win their franchise's first Stanley Cup, the NHL found itself in yet another lockout. Gary Bettman and the owners were fighting to reduce players' share of revenue and officially began a lockout in September 2012. This would ultimately continue through the rest of 2012, effectively canceling the first half of the season. The Coyotes would not get a chance to build public interest after a conference finals appearance until January 2013 when play finally began in earnest. They only had 48 games to prove that last year wasn't just a fluke. The Coyotes started off the shortened season slowly, losing 3 of their first 4 games. Thankfully, outside of the Blackhawks and Ducks, the Western Conference was up for grabs. They started February off strong, winning 6 of their first 9 games to begin the month, but found themselves on the losing end of 3 one-goal games at the end of the month. The losing continued well into March as the Coyotes slipped further and further from a playoff spot in the shortened season. Even with backup Jason LaBarbera performing admirably down the stretch for an injured Mike Smith, the team simply could not score enough to keep pace with the powerhouses in the Western Conference. Ray Whitney's absence was felt on the offense, and the team did nothing to replace his production. The Coyotes finished with 51 points in 48 games, which planted them 4 points out from a playoff spot. There simply wasn't enough time in the shortened season for mistakes and misfortune, and the Coyotes would miss the playoffs for the first time in 3 seasons. The excitement from the 2012 playoff run had run out, but the chaos behind the scenes was as potent as ever. There were several potential buyers while the NHL owned the team, but former Sharks CEO Greg Jameson was at the forefront and publicly stated his intentions to keep the team in Glendale. The team worked with Jameson in the city of Glendale during the 2012 offseason, signing a 20-year, $325 million lease that was approved by a 4-2 margin by the city. Unfortunately, Jameson was unable to meet a January 31st deadline to complete the sale due to several hurdles thrown by the city of Glendale and outside watchdogs like the Goldwater Institute, and they were basically back to square one. The team had less than 6 months to find a new owner and negotiate with the city of Glendale. In the ensuing mad scramble, an investment group called Renaissance Sports and Entertainment emerged as the frontrunners, and the NHL approved the sale of the team in late May. The purchase price was $170 million, but RS&E only paid $45 million, with the rest coming from loans and taxpayers. This was yet another bad sign, since it was this exact type of large debt and lack of equity that got the team into this trouble in the first place, but at least the team actually had an owner now. The biggest hurdle remained, however, which was the city of Glendale. The city was initially sympathetic towards the Coyotes, but 4 years of scandal and financial losses soured relations between the two parties. Meetings took place in June 2013, but there was no deal reached between the two sides. A June 25th council meeting was supposed to be the end of the process since the NHL Board of Governors was scheduled to meet 2 days later. However, no deal was reached during this meeting, but they agreed to hold a publicly televised council vote on July 2nd. Bettman was growing rightfully impatient since the NHL needed to know where the team would be playing to create the season schedule. On June 27th, the NHL Board of Governors met and officially cemented the July 2nd deadline. If there was no deal in place on July 2nd, the team would relocate to Seattle. The NHL had determined that Key Arena would be a satisfactory home for the team. This process was so far along that the arena held off scheduling new events. Finally, on the evening of July 2, 2013, the City Council met and voted on a new lease proposal. There were compelling arguments for both sides, especially considering the sheer amount of debt the team was in. Ultimately, the council voted 4-3 in favor of the lease, and the Coyotes would remain in Arizona. The lease was $225 million for 15 years, but came with the stipulation that the lease could be terminated in just 5 years if the team accrued $50 million in losses. This deal also satisfied the Goldwater Institute, and they did not offer any additional challenges. The Coyotes avoided being moved to Seattle just before the clock struck midnight, and now they could finally just focus on hockey. The core was mostly identical to the year before, with the largest free agent acquisition being Mike Ribeiro. The season started off strong, with Radim Vrbata netting a hat trick against the Rangers. They continued winning through October, just in time for a meeting with the Detroit Red Wings. In the closing seconds, Mike Smith makes a stop and takes a shot towards the empty net. It was an absolute laser down the middle, and with 1/10 of a second left, Mike Smith had scored a goal. This was the first time since 2002 that a goalie scored off a direct shot attempt, and this feat would not be repeated until 2020. The team had cooled off a bit after the hot start, but it still looked like they would return to the playoffs. On December 23, 2013, the Coyotes played the Sabres in Buffalo. The game went into overtime, and a Sabre shot was deflected up into the air. Smith didn't see where the puck landed and got back into his net. In an insane twist of fate, the puck had gone down Mike Smith's pants and he scored on himself. In just over 2 months, Mike Smith had scored 2 goals for 2 teams. Absolutely legendary. Around this time, the team formally announced a name change as a part of the new lease deal. They would now be the Arizona Coyotes, which makes much more sense. They had now played 10 of their 18 seasons in Glendale, several miles away from Phoenix. They still would remain Phoenix for the rest of this season, where they continue their stagnation in the standings. Ever since the Pants goal, the team remained in a mediocre holding pattern, going 17-17-3 and remaining just ahead of Dallas for the final playoff spot. So, as any Coyotes team would do in this situation, they lost 7 in a row to miss the playoffs by 2 points. That's 2 years in a row where the team arguably overperformed and fell back down to earth just to finish 9th in the West. It was clear at this point that the Coyotes needed to go into a full rebuild. The team's points leader was Keith Yandel, who only had 8 goals. The goals leader was Shane Doan, who was 37 years old at this point. The team wasn't getting any younger, and they would finally commit to a true rebuild. Longtime sniper Radim Verbata loved the Valley, but signed with Vancouver for one last chance to compete for the Stanley Cup. Even though Mike Ribeiro had a limited no-movement clause, the team bought out his contract in the first year due to issues with substance abuse. The void of free agent departures was growing and being patched with short-term journeymen. And if there was any year to rebuild, it was this one. You don't need me to tell you how hyped Connor McDavid was, and you certainly didn't need to tell GMs in 2014 that either. The Coyotes were just one of many teams throwing their hats into the ring for the greatest prospect since Sidney Crosby. The 2014-15 season was odd before the Coyotes even took the ice. The team's name change from Phoenix to Arizona was announced abruptly in the middle of last season, and there wasn't enough time to make a proper rebrand before the season started. This resulted in the team wearing their Phoenix Coyotes jerseys, but with a different shoulder patch reflecting the name change. The team announced ahead of time that they planned to unveil a new look for the next season, so this would be the only season where the Arizona Coyotes would wear this old style of jersey. The team also quietly retired the alternate running Coyote jerseys. The Coyotes started off poorly, but were by no means the worst team in the league. Backup goalie Devin Dubnyk provided a steady presence behind Mike Smith, but the team was aging and not particularly skilled. The start of the season was mediocre, but still had its moments. On December 27th, Shane Doan broke his stick during a shot attempt in a shootout, and the resulting goal would ultimately give the Coyotes the win. The team still had a lot of their old grit, but after a 6-0 loss on New Year's Eve, the wheels began to turn on the Great Tank of 15. They stood at 16-20-4 after a victory over the Jets on January 8th. With only the Sabres, Hurricanes, and Oilers having worse records. The tank officially began rolling on January 14th when Devin Dubnyk was sent to the Wild for a 3rd-round pick. Every tank needs a commander, and none fit the mantle better than Mark Arcobello. Mark started the season off in Edmonton, where he had been playing for the past several seasons, so he was certainly no stranger to a losing culture. He was traded to Nashville in December, where he would only play 4 games before being waived. After filling in for a month in Pittsburgh, he was waived once again and ended up on the Coyotes on February 11th. Just 2 days later, he suited up against the Sharks and scored less than 2 minutes into the game. The Coyotes lost the game due to a Joe Pavelski hat trick, which perfectly summed up the vibe of this tank. Arcobello continued to be a strong presence on an increasingly demoralized squad that was expected to lose every night. That game was lost too in what would become a 10-game losing streak, with the team trading Antoine Vermette and Keith Yandel for first-round picks in the midst of it. The Coyotes had a lone victory in this sea of red, a shootout victory over the Canucks where Sam Gagner was the lone scorer on a Kachina throwback Thursday. They lost 18 of their last 20 games heading into a game in Buffalo. This was a tank bowl of sorts, with Buffalo languishing in the standings all season long in the pursuit of McDavid alongside Edmonton. As a result, many of the Buffalo faithful were rooting for the Coyotes as they jumped out to an early lead. The Sabres tied the game with 3 minutes left, and the home crowd was dejected. Then, when the Coyotes scored to win it in overtime, the crowd went wild. The Coyotes would ultimately get their revenge by losing to Buffalo 4-1 at home, but would ultimately finish 2 points ahead of Buffalo in the standings. This gave them the second best odds at landing Connor McDavid, and at the very least gave them a good shot at Jack Eichel. But in true Coyotes fashion, they would be moved down to the 3rd overall pick, and Connor McDavid would become an Edmonton Oiler. The Coyotes had never moved up in the draft lottery in their entire history, despite always being terrible, and this was the 3rd first overall pick that the Oilers had landed in the last 5 seasons. The 2015 NHL draft came, and the Coyotes made the expected pick of Dylan Strome at number 3. At the time of the draft, Strome was widely considered the 3rd best prospect, but was seen as more of a project. Strome was seen as a skilled but undersized player, and obviously was not going to be the immediate franchise changer that his fellow top 5 picks were. The great tank of 15 may have failed at reviving the team the right way, but at least the team had bought time with a new lease. Oh wait, sorry, this is the Coyotes we're talking about. No, the team had already been running into new problems with the city of Glendale. The city alleged that 2 former city employees had been involved in securing the lease deal, then went on to work for the Coyotes. Thus, the city council voted 5-2 that the team broke a state conflict of interest law. For the record, both employees mentioned by name left their city jobs in April 2013, when the Coyotes still didn't even have an owner to negotiate with. The communications director was the only one of the 2 that was even employed by the other party when the lease was signed, and it's doubtful they would have even been allowed in the room for negotiations. The city of Glendale was also aware of these employees' work history as early as September of 2013, but seemingly only had a problem with it now. At this point, Coyotes fans were beyond fed up and exhausted with these bad faith attempts by the city of Glendale to weasel out of their own decisions and mistakes. The frustration felt around the fan base could best be summed up by this fan, who tore into Glendale leadership during these emergency hearings.
I've seen you at so many games, a number of times sporting a jersey that looks just like this one, with Mayor on the back and the number 1 on the back. How much did you pay for your jersey? How much did you pay for your tickets for those games? Because I know I paid a hell of a lot more than you did. I support this team. You don't. You don't show up to games and pay for your tickets. None of you do. What you're doing is childish, it's pathetic, and it's just disrespectful to the citizens who voted you in office, and for all of us that spent so much time and energy supporting this team when you never did.
That fan gained a bit of local fame for her cathartic rant, and actually got to tase the mayor of Glendale at a local fundraiser for first responders. Regardless, the tactic from the city worked, and the Coyotes were quick to renegotiate so that they wouldn't suddenly be relocated. The lease was changed to become a 2-year agreement that the team needed to constantly renew with Glendale, which became a ticking time bomb for the team. At least the Coyotes were here to stay for the next couple of years, to let the rebuild blossom. Before the 2015-16 season, the team unveiled actual new uniforms to go alongside the Arizona rebrand. These new uniforms featured black bands around the forearm, and a new modern font for the nameplates. Although many fans still yearned for the Kachinas, it was exciting to see a stylish new rebrand for the team. With a hollowed-out roster and no Mick Eichel to show for it, the Coyotes were expected to be the worst team in the league. This gave a golden opportunity for a new generation of Coyotes to make an impact. Max Domi was selected 12th overall in the 2013 draft and made his much-anticipated debut in Los Angeles to open the season. He would go on to score his first career goal to help the team win 4-1 over their bitter rivals. Anthony Duclair, who was acquired in the Keith Yandle trade, had a hat-trick in his 3rd game with the team. Domi and Duclair had developed chemistry together as they helped Team Canada win gold in the 2015 World Junior Championship. That chemistry carried over to the Coyotes, where they quickly earned the nickname the Killer D's. The team still wasn't good enough to be a contender, but they were rebounding well enough from a rock-bottom season. December started off terribly for the Coyotes, beginning with a 5-game losing streak. They were blown out in 4 of those games, and Mike Smith in particular looked like he was playing injured. Suspicions were confirmed after a 4-1 loss in St. Louis, as Mike Smith was sidelined with a lower body injury. Louis Domingue and Anders Lindbach would have to hold down the fort for a few months. The adversity seemed to help the team's performance as they ended the month by winning 4 of 6. They continued winning into the new year, maintaining a winning record and holding a playoff spot by mid-January. As the All-Star break rolled around, Coyotes fans were choosing which of their young talents would represent them for the game. In the spirit of 2016, however, a joke candidate suddenly became all too real. Fourth liner John Scott, who had only played 11 games with the Coyotes, had received the most votes out of any player and was selected captain of the Pacific Division. Neither the team nor Scott wanted this to happen, with John stating, "Listen, I don't deserve this. Vote for my teammates." The situation got even more bizarre when John Scott was traded to the Canadiens on January 15th, just weeks before the All-Star game, and was subsequently demoted to the AHL. Just 4 days later, however, Scott was officially declared captain of the Pacific Division, representing the Coyotes. He would go on to score twice in the first game of the tournament and would be named All-Star MVP. Once play resumed for the Coyotes, however, the inconsistencies of the team began to weigh them down. A 7-game losing streak at the end of February doomed them to the familiar realm of hockey limbo. On Leap Day 2016, the Coyotes traded Mikkel Bodker to the Avalanche for Alex Tanguay. The surprisingly strong start to the season had died down, but that's okay because the team was never supposed to be good this year anyway. Max Domi had a great rookie campaign, playing 81 games while being the team's second highest scorer. His chemistry with Anthony Duclair was legitimately exciting to watch as the team was finally beginning a youth movement. The team finished with 78 points, actually exceeding preseason expectations. This record was just good enough to miss out on a chance at Scottsdale native Austin Matthews in the 2016 draft. Before the draft, the team parted ways with longtime GM Don Maloney. Maloney took charge at the team's darkest hour during their bankruptcy scandal and gave the team their best years. However, his biggest weakness as a GM was drafting, and that was perhaps the biggest reason for the Coyotes being stuck in neutral. Just look at Maloney's first-round picks. Aside from Max Domi, the team completely whiffed on any pick that wasn't in the top 10, and even then he randomly traded Kyle Turris for essentially nothing in 2011, as he blossomed into a top-line forward in Ottawa. To replace the older Maloney, the Coyotes hired John Chayka. He was promoted from an analytics position at age 26, making him the youngest GM in NHL history. Chayka immediately flipped the switch on Maloney's draft habits, selecting young studs Clayton Keller and Jacob Chychrun in the first round. The team was expected to move on from coach Dave Tippett, but he showed promise the year prior, so he earned another shot. Chayka even brought back Radim Vrbata for the third time! During the 2016 offseason, the Coyotes bought their AHL affiliate, the Springfield Falcons. They announced their intention to move the team to Tucson, just 100 miles southeast of Phoenix. The team would become the Tucson Roadrunners, and they would begin play at the Tucson Convention Center for the 2016-17 season. After 20 years in Arizona, the Coyotes finally caught their Roadrunner. The 2016-17 season started off on a sour note. Mike Smith was injured once again in the second game of the season at the very beginning of a 6-game Eastern road trip. They would drop the first 5 games of the trip, only winning in the final game in Philadelphia. This put the Coyotes in a massive hole to start off, anchoring the bottom of the Western Conference all the way through November. Rookie Christian Dvorak was one of the few bright spots, quickly earning time on the top line and becoming the third Killer D. Unfortunately, even that tiny glimmer of hope would be quickly dashed. On December 8th, in the midst of a 6-game losing streak, Max Domi got into a fight with Flames forward Garnett Hathaway. Domi ended up breaking his hand during the fight and would be sidelined for the next several months. Even with Mike Smith's return, the team would go into a very cold winter, losing 14 of their 16 games surrounding Christmas. At this point, the frustration had reached its height, and the team found themselves hopelessly sliding backwards. They traded Martin Hanzal to the Wild for a first-round pick and embraced that this was yet another lost season. By the All-Star break, the Coyotes were in the familiar territory of hockey limbo, not even close to competing for a playoff spot, but somehow there were even worse teams around the league. The frustration had given way to the sad realization that we were watching Shane Doan's last season. He was on a 1-year contract, and at age 40, his production had finally taken a noticeable dip. It wasn't just Shane Doan though, the team as a whole was notably worse than the season prior. If not for the return of Radim Vrbata, the Coyotes likely would have finished dead last in the standings. His 55 points led the team by a considerable margin, with no other player even reaching the 40-point mark. Many of the team's prospects were still getting acclimated to the pro game in the AHL, so this season felt less like development and more like stagnation. The Coyotes limped to the finish line at home against the Minnesota Wild. Shane Doan assisted on the lone Coyotes goal, as Martin Hanzal scored the final Wild goal in their 3-1 win. The Coyotes finished with 70 points in a clear step back from the previous season. This was clearly a transition point for the team. Nobody was happy with how things were going, and it was finally time for the team to truly go in a new direction. As the 2017 offseason began, ownership changed hands once again. Andrew Barroway had been a majority investor with the team since 2014, but had now bought out the rest of his fellow Ice Arizona partners to become the sole owner of the franchise. Barroway had become the team's first sole owner since Jerry Moyes in 2009. As Barroway took full ownership, it was clear he was ready to take the team in a new direction. On June 17th, the day after Barroway took over, Mike Smith was traded to Calgary for a backup goalie and a conditional third-round pick. In just 6 seasons in Arizona, he had cemented himself as the greatest and most accomplished goaltender in Coyotes history. Smith was quick to vent his frustrations with the team's struggles, lamenting that he was glad to finally be with some guys that can actually score. Definitely a deserved dig though, as the Coyotes had a bottom 5 offense in the past 3 seasons while wasting Smith's prime. Meanwhile, it was time to talk with Shane Doan about his future with the franchise. Just 3 days after the ownership change, GM John Chaika arranged a meeting with Doan at First Watch, a popular breakfast restaurant in the Valley. Shane had rightfully believed that his 21 seasons with the team had earned him a say on if he would return for another year, but Barroway had different plans. The team had no plans to re-sign Doan, and after less than 10 minutes of this sloppy breakfast meeting, Doan walked out after shaking Chaika's hand. "I had been corporately fired. That's the way it felt," Doan said after the meeting. Chaika had confirmed the decision was made directly by Barroway and did not reflect the desires of the coach or GM. Doan was frustrated by the decision, but didn't hold a grudge. He, of all people, knew how much of a mess this team was at the very top, never having stable ownership during his playing time. Captain Coyote has the 3rd most games played with one team in NHL history, and the Coyotes would have been nothing without his steady presence along the way. Just 3 days later, the next domino would fall. Longtime coach Dave Tippett announced that he would be leaving his position as well. The team was expected to move on from Tippett this season anyway, as his style of coaching was not conducive for the rebuild. His old-school style of coaching was always better suited to taking an older roster and elevating them to be a playoff team, which is what he would go on to do in Edmonton. The next day, the 2017 NHL draft would begin, with the Coyotes ready to pick 7th and 23rd. The latter pick was acquired for Martin Hanzal back in February, and it gave John Chaika the incentive to go for a bold move. Chaika would trade the 7th overall pick and known jackass Tony DeAngelo to the New York Rangers in exchange for Antti Raanta and veteran center Derek Stepan. The Rangers have always been known for having strong backup goalies that were stuck behind Henrik Lundqvist, and Raanta was perhaps the most talented of them all. The Coyotes kept their 23rd overall pick and selected defenseman Pierre-Olivier Joseph. The team still needed a new head coach, and on July 11th, they decided on hiring Rick Tocchet. He previously played for the team for several seasons in the late 90s, and was an assistant coach under Wayne Gretzky in 2006. His most recent accomplishment was winning back-to-back cups as an assistant coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins, so the Coyotes wanted that upside. Instead of going deeper into a rebuild, this team was finally determined to compete while their prospects were starting to make the team. 3-time Cup champion Nicholas Hjalmarsson was acquired in a trade the same day, finally giving the team another strong defenseman alongside OEL. The team had completely shifted gears, and they were ready to break a now 5-season playoff drought. The 2017-18 season would begin in Anaheim, and the Coyotes wasted no time getting on the board. Duclair and rookie Clayton Keller gave the Coyotes a 2-0 lead in the first period, and it would be expanded to a 4-1 lead halfway through the second. For some reason though, Raanta was not starting this game. It was Louis Domingue, and he was not ready for the Ducks offense to come alive. 4 unanswered goals gave Anaheim a regulation win in a game where they were trailing by 3. Raanta was able to start the team's home opener against the Vegas Golden Knights in just their second game of existence. The Yotes led 1-0 for most of the game, with Raanta proving to be the brick wall that we were hoping he would be. However, with just 2 minutes remaining in the game, Nate Schmidt tied it up and the Knights would win in overtime. The next game was the first home game in Golden Knights history, and they came to play. Raanta allowed 3 goals on 5 shots and was pulled just 6 minutes into the game. The Coyotes actually outshot the Knights in the end, but the 3-goal deficit was too much to overcome. With 3 losses now, the Coyotes return home to face the Red Wings. Raanta started the game, but would not return after the first period. Once again, the Coyotes played a solid game but ultimately lost due to a late shorthanded goal. After the game, it was announced that Raanta would be out for at least the next few weeks, and the Coyotes would have to rely squarely on Louis Domingue for the time being. This came just in time for the Coyotes' kryptonite, the Boston Bruins. Last time the Coyotes beat the Bruins was in 2010, when they opened the season with back-to-back games in Prague. Boston had won their last 10 meetings, and this year was no different as the Coyotes dropped their 4th straight game to start the season. The losing would continue with 3 more regulation losses before the annual Eastern road trip. The Coyotes skaters would always put up a great effort, often outshooting their opponents during this losing streak, but the road trip would begin with 3 more regulation losses. This put the team's record at 0-10-1, tying the worst start by any team in NHL history. After their loss in New Jersey to achieve that dubious honor, GM John Chayka saw a golden opportunity to stop the bleeding. That night he traded for Devils backup Scott Wedgwood, placed Louis Domingue on waivers, and announced that Wedgwood would be the team's starter until Raanta returned. Wedgwood only had 4 starts under his belt in his young career, but desperate times called for desperate measures. 2 days later at Wells Fargo Center, the Coyotes jumped to a 2-0 lead in the first period. They held a 2-goal lead with a minute left in regulation. However, there can never be anything easy for this team, and the Flyers scored 2 goals in the final minute to send us to overtime. The Flyers dominated possession in overtime, but Clayton Keller knocked the puck away, setting up the overtime winner for Goligoski. It may not have been in regulation, but the team had finally won a damn game. It would take another 2 weeks for them to get their first regulation win, and another 3 weeks after that for their first regulation win at home. That win was a shutout by Scott Wedgwood against his former team. It was a historically rough start for Rick Tocchet, even while he was getting great production from his team's youth. 19-year-old Clayton Keller broke onto the scene, quickly becoming the team's best player. Jacob Chychrun returned from an injury in December and continued to prove his value to the team defense. The 2 Christians, Dvorak and Fisher, anchored a powerful third line before age 22. Even Brendan Perlini was looking good under Rick Tocchet. Unfortunately, the catastrophic start to the season killed any chance at breaking the playoff drought. However, as the season went on and Raanta returned, the team started to gain form and showed us what they were capable of. After the All-Star break, the team decided to make another trade, this time sending Scott Wedgwood and Tobias Reeder to the Kings for Darcy Kemper. Considering Kemper's stats in his short stint with the Kings, this trade was an absolute steal, securing a rock-solid backup for Raanta. After this trade, the team actually had a solid end to the season. They won 15 of their final 26 games, which was sadly their most impressive stretch in a long time. They finished the season with 70 points, the exact same amount they had the season prior, with the last point coming in an overtime defeat to the Canucks. The overtime winner was the final goal of Daniel Sedin's career, scored on Kemper. This was the first time in ages that the team seemed to have an actual direction, with an offseason that wasn't filled with arena drama. Clayton Keller had 65 points, the most of any Coyote since Ray Whitney's 77 points in 2012. This earned him a spot on the first All-Rookie team and 3rd place in Calder voting. The Coyotes selected Barrett Hayton 5th overall in the 2018 draft, and the team focused on signing extensions rather than free agents. Oliver Ekman-Larsson was rewarded for his loyalty with an 8-year, $66 million extension, which was extremely pricey for his current production. He was the lone player remaining from the 2012 playoff run though, so many fans weren't too upset by the deal. Chayka made a shocking move next, however, trading Max Domi for Alex Galchenyuk. This deal didn't make sense at the time, and it only continues to be more baffling as time goes on. Domi had shown significant improvement under Tocchet's system, and was one of the most popular players on the team. He was the face of the team's very long rebuild, and he was just randomly cast aside for a player of similar production. Nevertheless, the Coyotes hoped he was the missing piece to finally return to the playoffs as their drought reached 6 seasons. During the 2018 offseason, the team officially unveiled their first alternates since the Running Coyote jerseys. The Kachinas were back in full force, with a modified shoulder pads to remove the Phoenix. Although the team had worn the Kachinas every once in a while in the past few years, this was their first time fully committing to adding it back to the team's brand. Now, every Saturday home game would be a Kachina Saturday. The 2018-19 season would begin in Dallas, with the Coyotes being shut out 3-0. In their next game, the home opener against the Ducks, they were shut out 1-0. Thankfully, this was not the start of another historic losing streak, as they got their revenge in a shootout in Anaheim a few days later. The slow start was quickly corrected by a 5-game winning streak, and the team was hovering around 500 going into a November game in St. Paul. Minnesota led 3-1 after the second period, but Ronta would not return from the locker room for the third. Instead, third stringer Aiden Hill would come out to finish the game. The Coyotes shocked everybody in the third period, scoring 3 unanswered goals to give them a rare regulation win at XL Energy Center. After the game, it was announced that Antti Ranta would miss the rest of the season with a lower body injury. Darcy Kemper had been a solid backup so far this season, and had an opportunity to make his case for the starting job. Meanwhile, John Chaika was still shaking up the team's roster. Dylan Strome was struggling to start the season, and it was clear that a change of scenery was needed. He was traded along with Brendan Perlini to the Blackhawks for Nick Schmaltz. While Strome would eventually become the player the Coyotes envisioned, his development was just taking too long to fit in with the team's competitive window. Sending Strome and Perlini together makes the trade strangely symbolic. These are two of the last players drafted by Don Maloney, representing the end of that failed rebuild. The legacy of the failed tank lives on in Nick Schmaltz. The team continued playing at a very average level all the way to the All-Star break, where they sat at a 23-23-4 record. They were only a couple points out of the last playoff spot, but a 4-game losing streak coming out of the All-Star break seemed to spell another season in hockey limbo. It was at this point, however, that Darcy Kemper started to get locked in. Over the next month, the Coyotes won 10 of 13 games and were comfortably back in the playoff race. Kemper had a .942 save percentage during this stretch, which was the most dominant stretch by a Coyotes goaltender since Mike Smith's 2012 season. By now, Kemper had unquestionably become the team's #1 goaltender and was viewed as one of the best in the entire league. On February 24th, before a game against the Jets, the Coyotes would finally retire Shane Doan's number 19. Captain Coyote was as humble as ever during his speech, and he watched with his family as his number went into the rafters at Gila River Arena. They continued their winning trend afterwards, defeating the Jets 4-1. In true Coyotes fashion, however, they would be demolished 7-1 by the Blackhawks, with Brendan Perlini inexplicably scoring a hat trick. The team hit a bit of a skid with the trademark winless East Coast road trip, but they remained only 2 points back from Colorado for the final playoff spot. The two teams faced off on March 29, 2019, and this was undoubtedly the biggest game in recent Coyotes history. If they won, they would control their own destiny in this tight playoff race. The game would remain scoreless for the entire first period, but the Coyotes kept consistent pressure on the Avs defense. Midway through the second, the Avalanche got on the power play and Nathan MacKinnon gave the Avs a 1-0 lead, and would extend the lead with a last-minute goal in the period. The Coyotes were playing well, but they just could not get past Philip Grubauer. This finally changed in the third period, with Oliver Ekman-Larsson cutting the Colorado lead in half. With a minute remaining and an empty net, OEL buried his second goal of the night past Grubauer to send the Coyotes to overtime. Unfortunately, OEL was the only Coyote that could score on this night, as they got blanked in the ensuing shootout. Even with this loss, the Coyotes still had an outside shot at a playoff spot. They routed Minnesota 4-0 in the next game, and just needed to take care of business against the rebuilding Los Angeles Kings. So, with their triumphant return to the playoffs on the line, they proceeded to lay the most massive of eggs on home ice. The Coyotes outshot the Kings 50-23, but lost 3-1. This loss eliminated them from playoff contention, and can you honestly think of a more Coyotes way to do so? Especially considering the next game was a 4-1 victory in Las Vegas, a game that no one was expecting them to win. If they had just won that one game against the Kings, the Coyotes may well have made the playoffs. They finished the season with 86 points, just 4 away from the final playoff spot. It's hard not to think of all the what-ifs when the team got so close and was riding such a strong goalie tandem. Not to mention that Max Domi had 72 points in his first season with Montreal, a mark that no Coyote has even come close to since Doan's 73 points in 2009. In a season where they were only 2 wins away from a playoff spot, especially considering that Alex Galchenyuk was just kind of okay, it's hard not to think about where this team would be if they just never made that trade. But nonetheless, the playoff drought extended to 7 seasons. Disappointment aside, the team had genuinely made some huge strides this season. This was the first winning season for the team since the playoff drought began. This was the time for Chaika to go all in, and he sure did do something alright. He sent Galchenyuk and Pierre-Olivier Joseph to Pittsburgh in exchange for Phil Kessel. He may have been 32 years old, but he was still playing at a point-per-game pace alongside Crosby and Malkin. During January 2019, ownership changed hands once again, this time outside of ICE Arizona. Barroway sold a majority stake to real estate developer Alex Meruelo, but retained a minority interest in the team. Unlike all the previous Coyotes owners, Meruelo had plenty of capital and a proven track record of turning failing businesses around. In 2017, his group purchased the SLS Las Vegas, a struggling hotel on the north end of the Strip. At the time of purchase, the hotel was generic, corporate, and honestly had a really stupid name. Meruelo's group led an ongoing renovation effort of the SLS, renaming it back to its historic Sahara name. The efforts have largely been positive, both in public perceptions of the resort and profitability for the business. Alex Meruelo looked to bring that same energy to the Coyotes, and he was the first owner in team history that was a proper billionaire. This was the guy we had been waiting so long for, to finally uplift Arizona hockey and put them in the same vein as markets like Tampa Bay or Dallas. In his introductory press conference, Meruelo had a new energy that the team had been lacking, stating,
"And I sure want to win. And 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 I sure want to win."
The Coyotes came out of the gate in 2019-20 with a message to send. After getting their yearly losses to Boston and Anaheim out of the way, they went on a tear for the rest of October, winning 7 of their next 10 games. Kemper was a legitimate top 5 goalie in the NHL, with Raanta behind him who could easily be the starter on several other teams. The combination of great goaltending and timely offense from the likes of Connor Garland and Nick Schmaltz propelled the Coyotes comfortably into a playoff spot, and even leading the Pacific Division by December. While the team was having a hot start, Phil Kessel was hardly the difference maker that John Chayka envisioned, and the offense on the whole was sluggish. Chayka was looking to make another move to jumpstart the offense, and the perfect suitor was coming to town. The New Jersey Devils were sitting far outside of a playoff spot in the East in mid-December, and trade rumors swirled for their star Taylor Hall. The Devils scratched Hall for precautionary reasons against the Avalanche. The next day, the Coyotes traded their 2020 first-round pick and a few prospects for Hall. The trade was well understood to be a rental, with Hall being an RFA after the season. And since the Devils were already in town, Hall just had to trade jerseys and go with his new team. The all-in push would bring some hope for the team into a matchup against the Minnesota Wild. The game started well enough for the Coyotes, but the wheels fell off as they lost 8-5. Despite Raanta being ready on the bench and Kemper having already given up 7 goals on the night, Tocchet left him in the game. This proved to be a disastrous decision with just 3 minutes left in the game. Kemper was completely motionless on the ice after making a save, and he would have to be helped off the ice by medical staff. After the game, Tocchet confirmed that he didn't pull Kemper because he wanted to get him the win. Kemper headed to the IR with a lower body injury, and just 3 days after this team's all-in push began, they suddenly had to play without their best player. From there, the team slowly began to slide out of the playoff picture. Raanta was excellent after being thrust back into the starting role, but the addition of Taylor Hall simply was not bringing in the results. This backslide coincided with several other Western teams going on big winning streaks, and suddenly the Coyotes found themselves on the outside looking in, even after Kemper's return. By March 2020, they were 11th in the Western Conference and sitting 4 points out of a playoff spot. Well, I think we all know what else happened in March 2020. The league suspended play due to the pandemic, and uncertainty was in the air around the world. During the summer, the NHL announced that they would go straight to an expanded playoffs in a closed bubble environment. This format took the top 12 out of 15 teams in each conference, with the top 4 teams completing a round robin for seeding, and the 5 to 12 seeds playing a best-of-5 qualifying series to appear in the actual playoffs. As the 11 seed, the Coyotes faced off against the 6 seed Nashville Predators. Once play began at Rogers Place in Edmonton, Alberta, the Coyotes looked like their early season selves. The top line was finally clicking, as they jumped out to a 3-0 lead in the first period. The Predators would attempt a comeback, but the Coyotes emerged victorious in Game 1. Game 2 was the complete opposite, with Nashville jumping to a 2-0 lead that they would not relinquish. The Coyotes opted to wear the black Kachina jerseys for their designated home games, starting in Game 3. Christian Dvorak would put the Coyotes up early in the first period, but Nashville would answer back halfway through the game. The Predators were dominating this game, but Darcy Kemper stymied their offense from that point forward as the Coyotes pulled out a 4-1 win. The Coyotes were up 2-1 in this best-of-5 series, just needing one more win to return to the playoffs. Michael Grabner and Phil Kessel gave them a 2-0 lead, but the determined Predators offense finally broke through Kemper in the second period to tie the game up. Jordan Osterley would put the Coyotes back in front early into the third period, and after that, it was time to hunker down. The Predators were desperate to avoid going home, and kept the pressure on Kemper. The Coyotes held strong for most of the third period, but Philip Forsberg would tie it up with just over 30 seconds to go. For the first time in this qualifying series, we would need overtime. 5 minutes into the extra period, Vinny Hinostroza throws up a pass to Brad Richardson, who buried it to give the Coyotes the win. The Coyotes won this qualifying series, giving them their first playoff berth since 2012. It may have taken a pandemic stopping play, allowing the team to get healthy, but the Coyotes returned to the playoffs. Their opponent for the next round was determined by a separate round robin, and it was, of course, the Colorado Avalanche. Colorado had stunned the top-seeded Flames in the first round of the year prior, and subsequently have returned to cup contender status. Apart from Darcy Kemper, the Coyotes looked outmatched to start the series. He could only keep the team in the game for so long, as Nazem Kadri gave the Avs the lead on the power play. Just 10 seconds later, JT Compher would extend the lead, and the Avs would ultimately win 3-0. The Coyotes were outshot 40-14, which set the tone of the series early. Nathan MacKinnon would give Colorado an early lead in Game 2, but the Coyotes actually showed some fight in them by answering back and ultimately making it deep into the third, tied 2-2. With just under 3 minutes left, Andrei Burakovsky sniped what would ultimately be the game winner past Kemper. The Coyotes were down 2-0 in the series, and thanks to a tight schedule in the bubble, Game 3 was the next day. Derek Stepan gave the Coyotes an early lead, but they continued to get strong-armed by the Avalanche as the game went on. They tied the game up halfway through the second, but Brad Richardson would give the Coyotes the lead right back by the end of the period. The third period was another constant barrage for Darcy Kemper, but he kept a lid on it as Taylor Hall iced the game for Arizona. Kemper completely stole this game for the team, saving 49 of 51 shots that he faced. The Coyotes avoided a sweep, but their luck ran out just as Game 4 began. The Avalanche jumped to a 3-0 lead in the first period, with Nazem Kadri scoring twice. They eventually chased Kemper from net in their dominant 7-1 win, and blanked the Coyotes' offense yet again. Game 5 would be eerily similar, with Kadri scoring twice again in the first period as the Avs cruised to another 7-1 win. This series was an absolute slaughter from the beginning. Kemper was single-handedly keeping an overmatched squad in these games, but even he couldn't withstand the Avalanche turning up the pressure in the last two games. A disappointing finish, but the Coyotes did officially break their 7-season playoff drought. With the way their season was trending, they probably wouldn't have made it if not for the pandemic. But that's gotta be the most Coyotes way possible that they could have returned to the playoffs, as an 11 seed, a thing that only existed for this extraordinary circumstance. Just one day before these playoffs started, GM John Chaika abruptly resigned from his position. Once the season concluded, the Coyotes hired Bill Armstrong to be their new GM. Armstrong was the director of scouting for the St. Louis Blues for 8 years, a period in which they drafted the likes of Vladimir Tarasenko, Colton Parayko, and Gene Schwartz. This was an excellent hire, actually putting their money where their mouth was in terms of building for a brighter future. This was some uncharacteristically good news for the team. The bad news? It was revealed that Chaika had conducted a private scouting combine with potential future draftees, a practice strictly forbidden by the NHL. The penalty handed down by the league was to strip the Coyotes of their second-round pick in 2020 and their first-round pick in 2021. John Chaika was also suspended from working in the NHL in any capacity for the next year. So, the Coyotes finally got a smart drafter in a time where they wouldn't have a first-round pick for the next 2 years. They didn't have a pick of any kind in the 2020 draft until the 4th round due to all the various shenanigans that Chaika had been pulling. Once the 4th round finally arrived, the Coyotes managed to make the exact wrong pick by selecting defenseman Mitchell Miller. Even though he had the talent of a first-round pick, Miller is also just a complete piece of garbage. He bullied a developmentally disabled classmate in such a deplorable and racially charged way that he actually got sent to a juvenile court and was found guilty for it. I won't recount all of the details, but honestly the word bully doesn't even accurately describe how cruel and repulsive he was to this classmate. Bill Armstrong was put in a huge bind from the get-go, as he was not the one to draft Miller despite being the team's GM. He had reached an agreement with the Blues as a condition to taking this job to not participate in the 2020 draft, but he was obviously the fall guy for the decision. He initially tried to salvage things, stating that Miller's past actions were terrible, but they were willing to give him a second chance. The public outcry was strong, however, and the Coyotes would renounce their rights to the pick by the end of the month. Regardless, this was just such an unforced error that dragged the team's reputation down even further during a time where they were actually playing well on the ice. With the pandemic ongoing, the NHL was in a tough spot to figure out a plan to play the next season while conforming with national and local health protocols. Negotiations culminated in a 56-game season, with a temporary realignment of divisions to accommodate Canadian border restrictions during this time. The Coyotes were placed in the West Division, which consisted of their Pacific Division rivals from California and Las Vegas, as well as the Wild, Blues, and Avalanche from the Central. Teams would only play other teams in their division, playing multiple games against each other in a row, baseball style. As for the Coyotes, their roster remained largely the same from the year prior, with the notable departure of Taylor Hall. The team continued leaning into the Kachina jerseys, officially adopting the black one as their home jersey, and a purple one of the Peyote Coyote jerseys as a reverse retro alternate. Gila River Arena also boasted a purple moon logo at center ice, a very welcome throwback to their days in downtown Phoenix. The team didn't commit to a full rebrand yet, however, as they kept the Howling Head jerseys around. The white one was still their official away jersey, as they looked to build a brand new playoff streak. The shortened season began in January 2021 as the Coyotes returned to Gila River Arena. The arena only allowed 2,000 people in attendance, all carefully spread out to avoid the spread of COVID. The Coyotes got off to a mediocre 3-4-1 start, losing 3 out of their 4 games against the Golden Knights. The team looked more like their mid-season form from the year prior, struggling to generate much offense of any kind. As February began, a sudden shakeup in the schedule was announced. With sudden COVID outbreaks affecting the Wild and Avalanche, the teams needed to postpone their games in early February. The news happened to break while the Coyotes were playing in St. Louis, and both teams just suddenly lost their upcoming opponents. The two teams were set to play each other 6 more times in the coming months, so the decision was made to just simply play those games now. After dropping the first game in the series, the Coyotes rattled off 3 consecutive wins in St. Louis. With genuine momentum on their side, the Coyotes returned home and proceeded to lay an egg by losing the next 2 games. They would win the final game of the series though, winning this impromptu series overall 4-3. The Coyotes would continue to battle for the final playoff spot, but Kemper would go down with a lower body injury on March 8th. Ronta played well in relief, keeping the team afloat before being sidelined with yet another injury of his own. The team was down to Aiden Hill and rookie Ivan Prosvetov. They continued to get consistently inconsistent results no matter who was in net, however, as the team's offense just was not getting the job done. Phil Kessel was the only player that looked improved from the season prior, but he still wasn't exactly carrying the team to relevance. The Coyotes continued to slip out of the playoff picture through March and April, resigning themselves to the familiar realm of hockey limbo. They didn't have their first round pick this year, so this may actually be the most quintessentially Coyotes season ever. Nothing to win for, nothing to lose for, just simply continuing to exist for the sake of existing. The Coyotes finished 9 points behind the Blues for the final playoff spot in the West, and it was clear at this point that whatever window this group had was closed. The shortened season brought the NHL back to its traditional time frame, with the offseason beginning in mid-July. With things shifting closer to normal, Bill Armstrong was ready to get the team moving in a new direction with his first full offseason. The first order of business was to part ways with head coach Rick Tocchet. The Coyotes had brought him in to usher in a new era, but it ultimately was just more of the same, always near the bottom of the league in offense and having to rely on goaltending to just barely approach relevance. Because of how bizarre and tumultuous John Chayka's time at GM was, it's hard to really blame Tocchet for the team's shortcomings. He was ultimately a victim of circumstance, just like Dave Tippett before him. Andre Tourigny was named head coach soon after the team parted ways with Tocchet, and right away you could see the shifting direction for the team. Tourigny had an extensive history of coaching several levels of junior hockey, including winning Coach of the Year twice in a row in the OHL just a few years prior. With a new youth-focused coach, it was time to burn down the roster and get some assets. The team was able to acquire several second-round picks for taking on other teams' large contracts, such as Andrew Ladd and Shane Gostisbehere. On July 23, 2021, the first day of the draft, the biggest move of all was made. As previously mentioned, the Coyotes lost their first-round pick due to negligence from John Chayka. Bill Armstrong was not about to miss out on a loaded first round, and he traded Connor Garland alongside longtime captain Oliver Ekman-Larsson to the Canucks. Along with some bad Canuck contracts, the Coyotes got back the 9th overall pick in this draft, and yet another second-round pick next season. Armstrong used the 9th overall pick on Dylan Guenther, one of the most promising talents in the entire draft. Armstrong would also draft Shane Doan's son Josh in the second round. The moves didn't stop there. Darcy Kemper was flipped to Colorado for a first-round pick straight up. With Antti Raanta leaving in free agency and Aiden Hill being moved to the Sharks for another draft pick, the team suddenly went from 3 solid goaltenders to 0. At the same time as this fire sale was going on, the team was suddenly rocked by the news they'd been dreading for years. Glendale chose not to renew the lease beyond this season, and this would be the team's final season in Gila River Arena. The team's future was completely up in the air, but they would have this one last season in Glendale no matter what. The Kachina had slowly been coming back into the team's brand for the last several years, and the time finally came for them to fully embrace the past. The White Kachinas finally made their return as the team's official away uniform, bringing the era of the Howling Head to an end after 19 years. As October came, veteran goaltender Carter Hutton was named the starter ahead of a few prospects. Hutton wasted no time getting absolutely shellacked in the season opener against Columbus. Despite the Coyotes outshooting the Blue Jackets 38-26, Hutton allowed a ridiculous 8 goals on the night, not being pulled at any point. The next night, rookie Karel Vejmelka would start in net and stop 32 Sabre shots, but the team would eventually lose in the shootout. For some unexplained and unknown reason, Hutton was back in net for the home opener against the Blues. Things were fine for the first half of the game. The Coyotes held a 2-1 lead until halfway through the second. The following sequence really just needs to be seen to be believed. The Blues scored 5 goals in the next 5 minutes, and the terrible defense and goaltending made it look like a scrimmage. Vejmelka would start the next 2 games of the homestand, but the team remained winless. The Coyotes began a 6-game Eastern road trip, and Hutton was back as the team's starter. For the first period at least, before he was pulled. This would be the end of Hutton's Coyotes tenure, with a goals against average of 7.76 and a 7.41 save percentage. Although, it would be unfair to completely scapegoat Hutton for the 0-5-1 start, as the team was completely hollowed out and couldn't get wins with anybody in net. The losing continued to pile on against these Eastern Conference powerhouses, and even against the Flyers. A 3-1 loss in Anaheim brought the Coyotes to an 0-10-1 record once again, tying the worst start in NHL history for the second time in 5 seasons. Well, there's one lifeline you can always rely on when your team starts off on an 11-game losing streak, and he just so happened to be on waivers from the Devils. That's right, in some insane twist of fate, Scott Wedgwood was back in the desert. In the team's return home from their road trip and first ever game against the Seattle Kraken, Vejmelka let in 2 goals in the first minute of the game. Tyranny had seen enough, and it was Wedgwood time. After a defensive breakdown led to another Seattle goal, Wedgwood settled in and held down the fort while the Coyotes' offense finally showed some life. They came back from a 3-1 deficit to win the game 5-4 on regulation, with Wedgwood saving 27 Kraken shots along the way. If I had a nickel for every time Scott Wedgwood got the Coyotes their first win after an 0-10-1 start, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's genuinely insane that it happened twice, especially in the span of 5 years. With this single win in their hands, the Coyotes continued to play poorly, finding themselves on a 6-game losing streak in early December. At that same time, on December 8th, 2021, the team was informed that they would be locked out of Gila River Arena in 12 days due to an unpaid tax bill. Thankfully, the situation was resolved by the time the deadline was hit, but this was truly emblematic of the team's strained relationship with Glendale and lackluster attention to team operations. The team still didn't have a home for next season, and Meruelo needed to find one, and fast. A month later, the Coyotes announced that they reached an agreement to use Arizona State University's new hockey stadium as a temporary home while they figured out long-term arena plans. The arena was never planned to host an NHL team and had a capacity of just 5,000 seats. This is less than half of the size of the next smallest NHL arena and seats 12,000 fewer people than Gila River Arena does. The Coyotes never had too many sellouts in Glendale, but even the least attended games sold much more than 5,000 tickets. Back on the ice, the Coyotes continued losing at a relentless pace. Occasionally, they would get a random offensive burst or elite Vejmelka start to steal a win, but make no mistake, this team was absolutely atrocious. A horse blend of fourth liners that couldn't crack other teams' rosters, and a bunch of old guys that were in the twilight of their career, all culminating in one of the worst teams in the NHL that season, and quite possibly the worst Coyotes team of all time. The 0-10-1 start somehow wasn't even the most pathetic part of the season. Oh no, that came in early spring. They lost 6 in a row, looking increasingly weak as the streak went on. They did manage to defeat the Sharks and Blackhawks to not let it snowball into a bigger streak. After this though, they began a catastrophic stretch of 6 games, where they were outscored 7-38. They straight up didn't look like a professional hockey team, just completely lost and waiting for the season to end. The losing streak would reach 10 games, somehow breaking it on the road against the playoff-bound Wild. The season was winding down though, and the Coyotes had dropped their previous 7 home games with only 1 more left to play. The final game at Gila River Arena was against the Nashville Predators, where the Preds got out to a very quick 4-0 lead in the first period. Vejmelka was pulled for career minor leaguer Hari Sateri, and he was surprisingly locked in and stopped the bleeding. The Coyotes continued to slowly chip away at Connor Ingram on the other end, eventually tying the game up at 4 in the third period. The decisive 5th goal, and the final goal in Gila River Arena history, was scored by Shane Gostisbehere. The first game in this arena was a 3-1 loss to the Predators back in December 2003, and 19 years later the Coyotes ended their time in Glendale with their revenge. Even with their catastrophic stretch in April, this final victory once again caused the team to finish second to last in the standings. The Montreal Canadiens were in the Stanley Cup Finals in 2021, and yet somehow finished 2 points lower than the Coyotes to nab the top odds in the draft lottery. For good measure, the Coyotes got moved down to the 3rd pick as the Devils moved up to number 2. I guess it was a repayment for Wedgwood breaking the team out of their winless spell again. The 2022 draft saw several interesting developments. All season long, Shane Wright was seen as the top prospect that everybody was tanking for. Shockingly enough though, the Canadiens didn't take him first overall, and the Devils passed by him as well. The top prospect in the whole draft slid down to the Coyotes, but Bill Armstrong stuck to his draft board and selected Logan Cooley instead. It shocked many fans and analysts at the time, but with speculation that Wright didn't want to play in Arizona, this was the correct call for Armstrong to make. Shane Wright would be picked number 4 by the Seattle Kraken, and shortly afterwards it was time for a draft day trade. Bill Armstrong moved up, sending the 27th pick and a few second rounders to San Jose for the 11th pick, which he used to select Connor Geekie. Getting 2 guys named Cooley and Geekie was pretty funny, but their potential had fans around the valley excited for the future, even if the future would be in a college stadium. Just for a little bit, right? Because Mullet Arena was built with collegiate play in mind, the Coyotes had to wait for the arena to be retrofitted to NHL standards. Things like replay cameras, broadcast booths, and locker room upgrades that aren't necessary for a college team. This resulted in the Coyotes' schedule starting off with a 6-game road trip, playing 4 in a row at Mullet afterwards, and then embarking on a Goliath 13-game road trip that would last for over a month. This was the second longest road trip in NHL history, only surpassed by the 2010 Vancouver Canucks, whose arena was being used for the Winter Olympics. All things considered, I think Vancouver fans were a lot happier with their road trip. The Coyotes roster remained largely unchanged from the season prior, with the most notable changes being the departure of Phil Kessel and the signing of Nashville's Connor Ingram. They were still firmly in the rebuild, but the simple passage of time allowed more playing time for the team's young players and prospects. They also adopted a new orange version of the Peyote Coyote for an alternate jersey this season. The Coyotes embarked on their epic voyage in Pittsburgh, where they have not won since 2014. That streak continued with a 6-2 rout, and another loss in TD Garden pointed towards yet another terrible start to the season. Thankfully, a decisive 4-2 win in Toronto saved the team from needing to go find Scott Wedgwood again. They even picked up another win in Columbus to finish off their first trip, and they headed home to their new digs. The NHL accommodations lowered the capacity of the stadium to just 4,600. Mullet Arena is the only arena in any major American sport without an upper level, and a lot of focus was put into selling the intimacy of the arena. There isn't a single bad seat in the house, and you can clearly hear the players on the ice. The first game in Mullet Arena was against the Winnipeg Jets, because of course it was. The Coyotes got out to an early 2-0 lead, and the goal horn wasn't even working, which perfectly fit the whole situation. Even though the Coyotes eventually lost in overtime, the crowd was plenty loud and everything looked normal for a TV audience. A lot of attention was drawn to the locker rooms, as they more closely resembled a high school gym than an NHL venue. The locker rooms were still under construction at the time, but the completed versions were still not built to NHL standards. The team ultimately lost 3 out of 4 in the homestand, and it was time for the enormous road trip to begin in the nation's capital. In net on the other side was a very familiar face, Darcy Kuemper. Kuemper had won the Stanley Cup in his one-year stint with the Avalanche and got a nice payday from the Capitals. For the first 2 periods, he remained the brick wall that the Coyotes remembered fondly, holding a 1-0 lead for Washington. The third period turned the game on its head though, adding 3 unanswered to shock the Capitals in regulation. The Coyotes followed this up with a decisive 4-1 win in Buffalo and a 2-0 shutout against the Islanders. As the road trip went on, however, the losses began to pile up one after another. There was one bizarre break, a 4-0 win in Carolina, who had just finished a 116-point season and were on track to have another. This 36-save shutout was an anomaly, as it was their only win in the final 11 games of this grueling road trip. The first game back home in the now fully complete Mullet Arena was against the Boston Bruins. The odds were tremendously stacked against the Coyotes. Not only have they not defeated Boston at all since their 2010 Prague series, but the Bruins were also having the best start in NHL history. Their record stood at 21-3-1, with those few losses being to their fellow playoff teams. 23 seconds into the game, Josh Brown gave the Coyotes an early lead that silenced the Bruins' chance at Mullet Arena. The Bruins dominated possession from there, but the Coyotes made the most of their opportunities and found themselves in a tied game deep in the third period. With 20 seconds left, everybody in the building was expecting an icing call after Chychrun cleared the zone, but the linesman waves it off as Matias Maccelli pounces on the Bruins to set up Krause's game winner. The Coyotes were outshot 46-16, but pulled off the most miraculous upset in team history. The Coyotes finished December strong, but reality once again set in as they began 2023 with 9 regulation losses in a row. Around this time, Jacob Chychrun was traded to Ottawa for several draft picks, including Ottawa's first-round pick this year. The Senators were going for a playoff push as the Coyotes continued to slip back down into hockey limbo. They weren't as hapless as they were last season, nor as hapless as the Ducks, Sharks, or Blackhawks. The team would end the month of March with a 9-game losing streak, and they would limp to the finish line with 70 points. While most of the team was struggling to find their new identity, Clayton Keller had the best season of his young career. He scored 37 goals and put up a career-high 86 points, tying Keith Tkachuk's record set in the team's inaugural season. Keller had been developing into the next face of the franchise, and this season cemented his place at the center of their new core. This team had a legit youth movement, for real this time, and development was at the forefront of every decision they were making. The 2023 draft came, and the late season freefall gave the Coyotes the 6th overall pick. They went on to select defenseman Dmitry Simashev, which surprised many people at the time. The Senators had a late season collapse of their own, and the Coyotes used their pick to select Danil But, Simashev's teammate from the KHL. Because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, many teams were hesitant to invest in scouting in Russia, but Bill Armstrong's scouting team was a major exception. The hope is that their chemistry will carry on into the pros, but only time will tell. Unfortunately though, it was time for even more arena drama. With the team playing in a 4,600-seat arena, much of the season went on with speculation in the background as to what the team would do next. Alex Meruelo worked with the city of Tempe to create a proposal for a new entertainment district on the west side of town to be voted on by the citizens of the city. This was set to include not just the arena, but a separate theater building and nearly 2,000 multifamily residential units. The site that was chosen is a literal, actual toxic waste dump that regularly catches on fire. There was no displacement taking place, no eminent domain used to take people's houses, and it was to be primarily privately funded. The only public funding was to remove the toxic waste dump, which would have been a net positive for the city anyway. This was such a resounding slam dunk of a proposal, the kind of deal that would make all sides happy in the end. So, what happened? That's right, the Tempe voters came out and voted to keep the toxic waste dump. In the weeks leading up to the vote, a group called Tempe First emerged from the woodworks to oppose the arena vote. Their Twitter bio reads, "Tempe First is an all-volunteer, bipartisan group of Tempe residents who want to give Tempe voters the final say in the use of taxes, land, and public resources." The group made a conscious and expensive effort to spread misinformation about the arena deal, appealing to voters that were led to believe that their tax dollars would be funneled into the project. They also went after younger voters by hijacking progressive messaging to portray Meruelo as some sort of robber baron that wants to ruin the city of Tempe with a wasteful project. This was just simply not true. The only taxpayer funds going towards the project were to clear up the, once again, actual literal toxic waste dump that posed health hazards to the community. From some photos of the Tempe streets before the vote, the amount of no signs littering the street corners outnumbered the yes signs significantly, and the sheer amount of money behind the movement was enough to sway voters at the ballot box. The vote came as a complete shock to everybody involved. Even Gary Bettman was left dumbfounded that one of the most generous arena proposals in league history was voted down. The former mayor of Tempe also commented that he would not see that landfill be redeveloped in his lifetime, and that this was the best chance for the city to finally get rid of it. Ownership clearly didn't do their due diligence and did not assuage voters' concerns about how the arena would affect them, even if the fears were unfounded. They also failed to come to an agreement with labor unions, which created its own set of problems during the process and contributed to the failure of the proposal. Meruelo's ownership was turning out to be a failure of catastrophic proportions, as they were now stuck in this embarrassing arena situation that was supposed to be temporary. Immediately, speculation arose that the Coyotes would relocate for the upcoming season. This was quickly silenced though, as the Coyotes committed to playing the upcoming season in Mullet Arena as they had contractually agreed to do. In the background though, the future of the team was in complete disarray. Meruelo was quick to get back to the drawing board for a new arena, and there were several potential sites in Mesa that gained speculation, one of which being the former Fiesta Mall. Solutions kept being floated during the offseason, but the 2023-24 season would arrive with no plans set in stone, and the future of the franchise up in the air entirely. The Coyotes unveiled yet another new alternate jersey during the offseason, this time moving away from the Kachina head. This one is maroon with sand coloring on the accents and numbers. From the back, this may actually be my favorite Coyotes jersey, but they just had to ruin it with this credit union-ass logo on the front. The 23-24 season began with a familiar East Coast road trip, where the Coyotes actually won their opening game in New Jersey. This marked the first time that they won their first game of the season since 2016-17, the final year of Shane Doan and Dave Tippett's Coyotes tenure. The vibe of this team was certainly different from the get-go, giving up fewer goals overall and playing a more solid offensive game. On October 30th, the Chicago Blackhawks came into town with the number 1 pick in the last draft, Connor Bedard. Bedard dazzled right away by scoring less than a minute into the game, but the Coyotes stormed back very quickly to overrun the Blackhawks 8-1. Right off the bat, this year's edition of the Coyotes proved themselves to be extremely streaky. A 5-game winning streak around Thanksgiving gave way to a 4-game losing streak in early December, immediately followed up by a 4-game winning streak. They kept up pace in the wildcard race with the Blues, who were dealing with their own issues of streakiness. Just like clockwork though, on January 24th, the annual winter collapse began. 3 straight losses to Florida, Tampa, and Carolina led into the All-Star break, Or the hope was that they were just losing to quality playoff teams. After play resumed in February though, those hopes were quickly dashed and stomped on. They played Vegas and Nashville close in their first games back, but after returning home to Mullet Arena, the Coyotes were routinely bullied off the ice. Their loss streak would reach 11 as they were routed by the Maple Leafs on February 21st, and the end seemed to be nowhere in sight as the team embarked on a 5-game Canadian road trip. After 2 hard-fought losses to the Jets and Canadiens, the Coyotes took their 13-loss streak into Toronto. Surprisingly, the Coyotes hadn't lost a game in Toronto since 2002, so there was a lot on the line for this game. Either the catastrophic slide for the Coyotes continued, or the playoff-bound Leafs cement their curse against the Coyotes. Unfortunately, it was the former as the Coyotes suffered another hard-fought loss in regulation. Fun fact, 2 noted Coyotes fans scored for the Leafs in this game, Austin Matthews and Matty Knees. The losing streak would mercifully end the next day in Ottawa at 14 games. The Coyotes started off this losing streak with a winning record and were solid playoff contenders. Now, they were back once again in hockey limbo, the all too familiar realm that this franchise truly calls home. They'll beat a playoff team on the road and then come back to Mullet Arena to lose to the Blackhawks. Completely random results from an inconsistent young team with nothing to play for and nothing to tank for. This pattern continued through March 25th, when the surprise decision was made to call Josh Doan up to the NHL. That night, Josh had an immediate positive impact on the team's offense against the Blue Jackets. 16 minutes into the second period, Josh scored his first NHL goal, and Shane could not be happier. He would score again in the 6-2 win, and for one beautiful day, Josh Doan had the most goals per game in NHL history. Josh continued his strong play down the stretch, but after a brutal 5-0 loss to the Kraken, the hockey world was rocked with major news. On April 10th, 2024, the NHL had drafted alternate schedules for the upcoming season for the Coyotes. One schedule in Tempe and one in Salt Lake City. The flames of speculation were being quickly fanned around the hockey world, while the Coyotes were up in Vancouver getting ready to take on the Canucks. Despite the circumstances and getting blown out the night before, the Coyotes entered Rogers Place and gave the Canucks everything they had. Dylan Guenther assisted on the first 2 Coyotes goals and cashed in with one of his own to make it 3-1. Former Coyote Connor Garland would strike back, however, and the Canucks scored again 5 minutes later to take it to overtime. Deep into the 3-on-3, Sean Durzi finds Dylan Guenther, who secured his 4th point of the night off a beautiful shot from Logan Cooley. The following days saw speculation turn into a cold reality, and on April 12th, the news was solidified. Bill Armstrong flew out to Edmonton that night to inform the players that the team would be moving to Salt Lake City the next season. The team only had 3 games left, could not move anywhere in the standings, and now wouldn't even have their city next year. The team could have rolled over and died, but they came out looking more focused than ever. Josh Doan put the Coyotes in front in the first period, as they once again took a Pacific powerhouse to overtime. A few minutes into the extra period, Matias Maccelli absolutely roofed it over former Coyote Calvin Pickard to secure another improbable win. The Coyotes made the familiar trek from Edmonton to Calgary to face the Flames on the 14th, where 2 quick goals for both sides and a fight set the tone early. Dylan Guenther and Josh Doan put the Coyotes ahead in the second period, but 2 Nazem Kadri goals in the third period sealed the win for Calgary. There was only one game left, April 17th, 2024 versus the Oilers, the last professional game at Mullet Arena and the last game for the Arizona Coyotes. Many fans were planning to make this game one final whiteout, and on the day of the game, the team's Twitter account chimed in to spread the word. Before the game, Shane Doan was reunited with his retirement banner that was previously missing from Desert Diamond Arena. In the hasty move from Glendale to Tempe, the Meruelo ownership completely neglected to bring along anything Coyotes related, and the banner was just sitting in an arena worker's living room this whole time. It's some sort of beautiful poetry that came out of this depressing situation. Once the final game began, Liam O'Brien got the Coyotes on the board first, with Maccelli, Krause, Guenther, and finally Sean Durzi scoring all the final goals in Coyotes history in the 5-2 win. Connor Ingram was the last goaltender the team defeated in Glendale just 2 years ago, and now he stood as the final Coyote to record a win. The game was full of chants such as, "Utah sucks," but the most emotional time was immediately after the final buzzer. The players waved their sticks to the crowd and went to center ice with all of the team staff to get a group photo. The The fans stuck around for some time afterwards, not wanting to say goodbye to the team they'd given so much of their lives cheering for. Eventually, though, the send-off was over, and the Arizona Coyotes were officially deactivated the following day. With the May 2023 rejection of the Tempe arena plan, the Coyotes brass spent the rest of the year panicking and attempting to find a new arena plan. Eventually, they landed on a parcel of land at the northwest corner of Scottsdale Road and the Loop 101 in the northeast corner of the valley. In January 2024, the Coyotes unveiled their official plans to buy the land at auction on June 27, 2024. Just like the Tempe renderings, the complex was to include not only an arena, but also residential and office buildings. Cracks immediately began showing with this proposal. Even though the process itself seemed to be going along smoothly, many outside voices stressed their disagreement with the move. Most notably, the mayor of Scottsdale came out with strong opposition to the project, citing the intensive resources required to run a stadium that's just across the street from his city. It would only take a few months for this to become a footnote in the age-old local arena debate, though, once the rumors of relocation became a reality. The news came out of nowhere on April 10th, and closely followed the pattern of previously relocated franchises such as the Atlanta Thrashers. When the news hits, the NHL prefers to rip it off like a band-aid. April 18th is the date that continued to circulate after the news broke, which lined up perfectly with the end of the regular season. Ownership was radio silent, a fact acknowledged by Meruelo himself in a public statement on the 13th. Once the fateful day of April 18th hit, ownership's silence was broken, and the team was officially moved to Utah. In an incredibly awkward press conference afterwards, Bedman revealed that he told Meruelo about the relocation on March 6th, and Meruelo was staunchly opposed to it. Meruelo did nobody any favors during this press conference, where he was visibly uncomfortable and expressed his negative views on the media directly to the media. Meruelo spent the press conference reaffirming his commitment to hockey in Arizona, which rang even more hollow now than it did when the team still existed. The Coyotes were officially deactivated on April 18th, and the new Utah team would be treated as an expansion team in the record books, and the Coyotes' history would remain dormant in the desert. The bitter irony of the Coyotes moving is where they decided to move to. Instead of the common refrains we're used to hearing like Houston, Kansas City, or even Quebec City, they ended up in Salt Lake City, a metropolitan area a quarter the size of Phoenix, in a state with less than half the population of Arizona. Utah doesn't even have an NHL-ready arena yet, so the currently named Utah Hockey Club will have to play in the Delta Center for the foreseeable future. The Delta Center was built in 1991 for the NBA's Utah Jazz with basketball in mind, and as a result, there are several sections of obstructed view seats around the stadium. The plan for the future of the franchise is a publicly funded NHL-tailored arena downtown to revitalize a stagnant but important town center. Sound familiar? Fortunately for Utah fans, Ryan Smith is actually a committed professional sports owner, and the local government is actually welcoming them with open arms. Even though their beginnings are eerily similar to the Coyotes, they're already on track to be more successful. There's not a doubt in my mind the Utah Hockey Club, or whatever they rebrand to, will at least make the playoffs within the next 3 years. I wouldn't be shocked at all to see the Stanley Cup in Salt Lake City in the near future either. After all, they're not the Coyotes anymore. That franchise deactivated, and all of their history and associated curses are still stuck in Arizona. Alex Meruelo's final pathetic gasp to bring the Coyotes back himself was dealt a major blow on June 21st. The city of Phoenix abruptly canceled the land auction only a week before it was set to happen. The now defunct franchise took to Twitter to voice their disappointment with the decision. Once again, Meruelo did not do the proper due diligence on his own master plan, and did not secure the proper permits to even enter the auction. This final showing of ineptitude cemented that moving the team was unfortunately the right decision for the NHL to make. On June 24, 2024, the Florida Panthers defeated the Edmonton Oilers to win their franchise's first Stanley Cup. Former Coyotes Nick Cousins and Oliver Ekman-Larsson achieved what was ultimately impossible in Arizona, in a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. Mere hours after the cup was awarded to the Panthers, Alex Meruelo announced that he would be stepping down as the owner of the Coyotes franchise and return the brand to the NHL. He would maintain ownership of the Tucson Roadrunners and continues to dangle the threat of relocation to Reno over their heads. He may not be fully out of the picture yet, but good riddance to the Coyotes' harbinger of death. Alex Meruelo pulled the wool over everybody's eyes, from fans to executives, all the way up to the commissioner himself. Several years before he even took ownership of the Coyotes, he had failed ownership bids for the NBA's Charlotte Bobcats and Atlanta Hawks. He was simply outbid by Michael Jordan for the Bobcats, but the attempted purchase of the Hawks went further. He essentially was celebrated as the new owner in August of 2011. By November 2011, though, his ownership bid was withdrawn. The majority of existing owners were concerned that he didn't have proper financing for team operations, despite him flouting his wealth constantly. After this failure in Atlanta, he took a break for a while to focus on the hospitality industry, such as the renovation of the SLS Las Vegas. He even bought a damn island in the Mediterranean during this time. By 2018 though, he was ready to get back into it, and the NHL was seemingly just happy to have someone ostensibly wealthy to show interest in the most troubled team in the league. There was seemingly no vetting process similar to the NBA's, as that would have shown the exact same problems that ended his Hawks bid. Arizona hockey fans weren't exactly aware of his past, and we were just happy to see an apparent billionaire swoop in and possibly save the team. We all ate up his initial press conference, where he proudly stated that he'll sure as shit want to win. After all, this was after 2 decades of apathy and incompetence at the helm while the team continued to bleed money. Right off the bat, Alex Meruelo was a very absent owner, and delegated day-to-day operations to team president Javier Gutierrez and his completely unqualified and untalented son. It didn't take long for the team to get involved in a scandal by selecting Mitchell Miller in the 4th round of the 2020 draft. Since Bill Armstrong was not allowed to participate in this draft, that horrendous pick had to have been approved by upper management within the organization. It really just screams, I didn't do my homework and just picked the guy with a lot of points. Even back then, a simple Google search would have told them why all the other 30 teams in the league were passing on this asshole. Meruelo's complete lack of tact and knowledge of the business continued to be a drag on the franchise. It finally reared its ugly head in 2021 when the Coyotes were locked out of Gila River Arena due to an unpaid tax bill. This is something that is so routine that I can't even find any other instance of an owner failing to do it. Meruelo chalked it up to human error, but this plain incompetence combined with the lack of accountability was the defining feature of his time as owner. Plus, considering the fact that the Coyotes had become notorious for not paying hotel or food bills around this time, it's safe to assume that Meruelo just didn't want to pay his tax bill. In just 2 short years of ownership, he managed to completely burn the bridge between the team and the city of Glendale, a relationship that, while certainly sour beforehand, had been successfully navigated by people much less wealthy than himself. The Coyotes were left without a home in 2022 and needed to play in a college arena. Mullet Arena was brand new at the very least, and it did signify a genuine connection between the two programs after years of stalled negotiations. Regardless, an NHL team playing in a 5,000-seat college arena is not only embarrassing, but it actively hurts the reputation of the league as a whole. While so much focus was being put into selling the intimacy of the new tiny arena, the ownership group remained closed off. Why else do you think I keep using the same 3 pictures of him from when he signed on as owner? Alex Meruelo kept his son in charge of whatever he wanted in day-to-day operations, and he ruled with an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. That's the last thing a franchise on death's door needed, especially coming from someone who's just playing around with daddy's money. While the team was being run on a shoestring budget by this billionaire owner, he had no problem spending top dollar on a new fashion designer for the team at the behest of Junior. This collaboration brought a bunch of mediocre, overpriced apparel that wasn't very widely popular. A lot of it wasn't even available through the team's official store, and those that were available just looked like regular streetwear with no connection to the team. Their final Desert Knights jersey was also designed by this guy, and the incredibly lazy cactus on the pants that looks like it was made in MS Paint combined with the ugly credit union-ass logo on the front really makes me question this whole venture. The complete apathy from Meruelo himself continued to cause issues when the team needed to spread word about their new arena plans. He put the team in such a terrible situation that the Tempe voters opted to keep the, and I can't stress this enough, literal toxic waste dump instead of building a new arena. He made absolutely no effort to spread the word about his side of this vital vote, and he was defeated by good old-fashioned misinformation. Losing that vote was the final nail in the coffin for the team, even as Alex continued to desperately flail for any possible arena option to keep the circus going. Thanks to Meruelo, the team was on their way out of town. Even when the Coyotes were about to be relocated, the depths of this ownership's ineptitude and complete apathy toward itself was highlighted one final time. Shane Doan's retirement banner had been mysteriously missing from Mullet Arena this whole time, and that's because it was completely discarded by Meruelo. The absolute nerve and gall to leave behind the only tangible piece of history that this team has, it can seriously never be understated. That's the kind of thing that can only be done out of malice or complete disregard for what the hell you even own. Imagine moving into a new house and forgetting all of the furniture from your old house. That's pretty much exactly what he did in 2022. After the banner was returned to Doan, it found a new home at the Ice Den in Scottsdale, the final bastion of hockey in Arizona. That leads us to present day, where the Coyotes no longer exist and the fruits of their first properly done rebuild will blossom in Salt Lake City. No matter what way he tries to spin it, this was Alex Meruelo's choice. At any point along the way, he could have chosen to be a more active owner and not sleepwalk the team into these various self-made pitfalls that led to this horrible outcome. Even if he was truly blindsided by the NHL's intentions to move the team in March, he really shouldn't have been. What else would you expect when you got yourself stuck in a college arena for at least the next 4 seasons, with no arena even close to being built? Did this dumbass really think the NHL was just gonna let them keep playing in Mullet Arena forever? Well, he almost certainly didn't. After all, he was set to win an indescribable amount of wealth for sinking this franchise into the ground. He had every incentive in the world to not care about the Coyotes, and his actions or lack thereof as owner made that clear. The Coyotes were just one of many things for him to own, in the incredibly warped reality that billionaire real estate moguls live in. He bought the team for the most naive and out-of-touch reason, because his son wanted one. Nobody watching this video right now can relate to having the means to fulfill such a childish and ridiculous wish, but Alex Meruelo decided to make it all of our problems. I highly recommend reading Steve Peters' open letter to Alex Meruelo if you'd like a closer look at how operations were under him. Under Meruelo's ownership, team operations seemed to embody all of the worst traits of venture capitalism, a high-strung environment that's entirely focused on cost-cutting, whether it was the roster of the team itself or the tools the staff behind the scenes needed, like computers or printers. The vibe was closer to a public school having to deal with budget cuts rather than a professional hockey team, giving off the impression of making a profit rather than doing the work necessary to be successful in the sports business. Needless to say, this team was dead from the moment he stepped on board. Eat shit, Alex Meruelo, and may the tale of your cataclysmic ownership tenure live on in infamy alongside the likes of Harold Ballard. The Coyotes were truly a one-of-a-kind disaster, constantly finding new ways to disappoint those loyal fans that stuck by them. Whether it was factors outside the team's control, terrible ownership, horrendous roster construction, or good old-fashioned underperforming, nothing could ever go right for this team. This has been an incredibly unlucky franchise from the very beginning, all the way back to their days in Winnipeg. After a successful 70s in the WHA, the Jets spent the 80s and early 90s playing second fiddle to their rivals in Alberta, never advancing further than the semifinals in a very lenient playoff system. Financial problems forced the team to move to Phoenix, Arizona in 1996, where they made an immediate positive impression with the locals. Hockey was non-existent in the area at the time, but now that the Phoenix Coyotes were in town, the scene grew tremendously over the years. The Coyotes were competitive in their first half-decade in the desert, but they failed to make even the slightest amount of noise in the playoffs, failing to win a series in their 6 attempts in downtown Phoenix. The team continued to operate at a loss as interest waned for a declining product. The Coyotes had long needed a new arena, and owner Steve Ellman promised to be the one to get it done. After several years of failing to get it built at the Los Arcos Mall site that he already owned, he cheaped out and moved the team 17 miles west of downtown Phoenix. The move to Glendale Arena in 2003 coincided with a rebrand for the team, and unfortunately also coincided with the 2004 lockout. The product on the ice suffered for the next half-decade as the disinterested businessman at the helm continued to run the franchise into the ground. The team was never profitable from the get-go, but the first 5 years in Glendale turned the Coyotes from just another struggling team in a non-traditional market into a legitimate financial problem for the league. The NHL took ownership of the team after a very ugly bankruptcy dispute in 2009, and the few years of relative stability up top showed us what this team was capable of being. Coach Dave Tippett was the perfect fit for Captain Coyote Shane Doan, and the gritty group of veterans found their way back into the playoffs. They were defeated by Detroit 2 seasons in a row, but in 2012, they finally broke their curse by advancing all the way to the Western Conference Finals. It was a magical run that truly poised to put hockey back on the map in Arizona after a scandalous decade in the desert. And just when they had given existing fans hope and drawn in a brand new generation of hockey fans across the valley, it was back to underperforming and constant drama behind the scenes. They failed at competing, they failed at tanking, they failed at drafting, they failed at developing talent, and they ultimately wasted Shane Doan's career just floundering around in hockey limbo. Once Doan retired and there was much change around the organization, the Rick Tocchet era got off to a catastrophic 0-10-1 start, but rebounded to simply just be mediocre again. In 2020, they managed to make the playoffs thanks to a pandemic-specific playoff format, but that fun was short-lived. The team was stuck in neutral thanks to negligence from John Chaika at GM, and he was replaced by Bill Armstrong. Armstrong replaced Rick Tocchet with Andre Tourigny, and tore the roster down to its foundations. Just in time for a full switch back to the Kachina jerseys, the Andre Tourigny era got off to another catastrophic 0-10-1 start. The Coyotes managed to tie for the worst start in NHL history twice in 5 seasons, both times to start off a bald guy's coaching tenure, and both times the same goalie ended the losing streak, Scott Wedgwood. After they moved to Mullet Arena in 2022, the team was back to the familiar realm of hockey limbo, too bad to compete for a playoff spot, but just good enough to not get any of the high draft picks. But the final year of the team's existence really showed something special on the horizon. The fruits of Bill Armstrong and Andre Tourigny's labor, the future that we had been waiting for throughout our time as Coyotes fans. Logan Cooley, Dylan Guenther, Matthias Michelli, Josh Doan for God's sake, and then all of a sudden, it's just gone. It's just up in Utah now. A place that, generously, will have the same challenges facing them in the future that Arizona did, regardless of how successful they are on the ice. But for the players and coaches of this long-tortured team, this is the kind of fresh start they've needed. The increasingly disastrous Meruelo ownership had taken its toll on the fan base for sure, but actually having to deal with the substandard facilities and nonsense behind the scenes every single day? I'd be excited for a clean slate in Utah too, even if the arena's still not perfect. I keep thinking about how rough it's going to be seeing all these former Coyotes thrive in their new environment. Seeing the heavy hitters of Keller and Cooley compete in the bland temporary Utah jerseys, or seeing our old prospects make the team once they've rebranded to the Yeti or whatever worse name they'll come up with. But it got significantly less sad for me when I realized that we've been watching that happen already for the past half-decade. Whether it was Darcy Kemper, Aiden Hill, or most recently Oliver Ekman-Larsson, there's no shortage of former Coyotes going on to achieve greater things. Things that were ultimately never possible in Arizona, actually making their mark on hockey history instead of being permanently attached to its most depressing footnote. The Coyotes embodied the spirit of Charlie Brown right until the bitter end. For nearly 30 years they went to kick the ball, saw Lucy pull it away from them, and dusted themselves off and went back to trying again. Everything can change in just the blink of an eye though. Lucy's no longer pulling the ball away. She's suddenly moved to Utah, and Charlie's just left all alone. He always hated the feeling of falling on his back, but now that the game was gone, he would do anything to have it back again. The team was the laughingstock of the NHL for most of its existence, and being a fan required more following of local politics than actual hockey, but now that the team is gone, there's just a void that can't be filled. I became a fan of this team in middle school, during their 2012 playoff run. It came at such a formative time of my life, and all of the real-life hype that I saw from my classmates and the fan base at large caused me to buy into sports as a whole. From 2013 through 2019, I made sure to attend every home opener among countless other games, and was in the building when Shane Doan's jersey finally went into the rafters at Gila River Arena. Even though they only gave me a terrible product for the whole time I watched them, the Coyotes still had a hugely positive influence on my life. I only speak of my experience because I know that this team has had a similar effect on so many of us, especially for those of you that have been watching them for longer than I have. They were always a group that knew they were looked upon as outsiders, and no matter how much resistance they faced, they would always find a way to move forward. And if the players didn't necessarily fit that role, the fan base certainly embodies those traits better than any other. There's quite literally no other franchise in American sports that had it as bad as Coyotes fans, yet we're still here, even after the team's gone. It's always been fun to be a part of the pack, whether it was celebrating a win in person or tuning into pack therapy on PHNX after a tough loss. It feels like I genuinely lost a good friend on April 17th, 2024, and I know that I'm not alone in that feeling. Every time I think about the ending of this saga, I start to tear up, and I feel a certain bitterness. Arizona deserved better, the players deserved better, and the fans of this corpse of a franchise definitely deserved better. If the team had proper investment and ownership, who knows what could have been? There's no inherent reason that places like Tampa Bay, Las Vegas, or Nashville are better hockey markets than Phoenix. Their teams just spent their time actually trying to win rather than being content just simply existing. As much as it pains me to say it, the history of their first attempt in Arizona will likely deter them from going back there over other, sexier options for future expansion. Especially as long as there continues to be no viable arena option in the Valley. But I don't know, you don't know either. I mean, it's still 2024, unless you're watching this in the future, of course, in which case I love you, and feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments. The Utah Hockey Club's still in their inaugural season. They haven't even branded to real jerseys yet. For all I know, in the next 5 years, Matt Ishbia of the Suns could just solve all these problems by building a dual-use stadium for basketball and hockey. Or absolutely nothing happens. All I know is that hockey does belong in Arizona. The freezing indoor ice rinks are a perfect respite from the harsh desert heat, and during the hockey season, the weather is perfect. It's a game that we all desperately want to love, but it hasn't loved us back. Whether it's ownership woes, or arena drama, or just being terrible and irrelevant for decades, there hasn't exactly been too much to cheer about as a Coyotes fan. And now, the comfortable mediocrity of this team has now been swallowed by the existential dread that was surrounding it for decades. Who knows if professional hockey will ever return to Arizona? I certainly don't. We'll never truly know what the future holds, but knowing what the past has given us is the best way that we can keep moving forward towards a brighter and better future. Keep on howling till we meet again. Remembering the Coyotes. Hey, if you made it this far, I really appreciate you. I'm not a YouTuber, I'm just a fan that had a lot to say about my dead hockey team. However, if you liked this video and would like to see more, be sure to like and subscribe so I know that the interest is there. Making this video was a ton of fun, and I'd love to go into other subjects in the future. Peace out.